Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Nightmare Narratives. I can picture some of you already in bed, maybe some of you just getting home from work. Wherever you are, whatever time it is, I'm glad you're here. If this helps you relax or sleep, please like and subscribe. It means a lot. Now let's get you comfortable, and I'll tell you tonight's story. My name is Rebecca Thornwood, and I've spent 15 years studying plants in these Kentucky mountains. When people hear I'm a botanist, they usually think it's a boring job counting leaves and pressing flowers. But the Daniel Boone National Forest isn't like your backyard garden. These mountains hold secrets that go back thousands of years, and some of those secrets should probably stay buried. I got my PhD when I was 25 and came straight to the Red River Gorge Research Station. The isolation never bothered me. 30 miles from the nearest road, surrounded by sandstone cliffs and natural arches that tower over hidden valleys. It felt like paradise for someone who'd rather talk to trees than people. The Cherokee used to call this place home, and their stories about the Green Mother were just folklore to me. Old tales to explain things they didn't understand. That summer of 1979 was different from the start. The drought had been going on for 2 months, and plants that should have been thriving were dying. Not just wilting, actually dying in ways that didn't make sense. I'd find wildflowers that looked like they'd been drained of life overnight, their stems black and twisted. Even the hardy mountain laurel was struggling. But some plants were doing too well. I kept finding patches of vegetation that seemed impossibly green and healthy, growing in perfect circles. The vines there grew faster than anything I'd seen, sometimes a foot in a single day. When I tried to take samples back to the lab, they'd turn to mush before I could get them under the microscope. The first real sign something was wrong came when I found Tommy Brennan. Tommy was a graduate student from the University of Kentucky, 23 years old with red hair and freckles. He was supposed to help me catalog rare plants for the summer. Smart kid, always asking good questions. When he didn't show up for 3 days, I went looking. I found him in a grove of old oak trees, about 2 miles from the research station. At first, I thought he was sleeping against a tree trunk. Then I got closer. The kudzu vines had grown through him, not around him, through him. They came out of the ground, went into his back, and came out his chest. His eyes were open, staring at nothing, but his face looked peaceful, almost happy. The vines were thick as my arm and green as emeralds, pulsing slowly like they had a heartbeat. I threw up right there in the leaves. Then I ran back to call for help. The sheriff took 4 hours to reach us. By the time he arrived with the coroner, the vines had pulled back into the ground. Tommy's body had no wounds, no marks. The official report said environmental accident, maybe he'd been poisoned by something and wandered into the woods to die. But I knew what I'd seen. Those vines had been alive, moving, beating. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound outside made me jump. The forest felt different now. Like it was watching me. When morning came, I almost packed my bags and left. But I'm a scientist. I needed to understand what was happening in these mountains. I just wish I'd left when I had the chance. The next few days, I stayed close to the research station. I told myself I was being careful, but really I was scared. Every time I looked out the windows, the forest seemed to be pressing closer. Vines that I swore hadn't been there the day before now crept up the sides of the building. My radio crackled to life on Thursday morning. Dr. Elizabeth Miller's voice came through, full of excitement. "Rebecca, we're coming up to help with the plant survey. The university is very interested in your reports about unusual growth patterns." I wanted to tell her not to come. Something was wrong in these woods, something dangerous. But how could I explain about Tommy and the vines? She'd think the isolation had gotten to me. The team arrived Friday afternoon in 2 jeeps loaded with equipment. Dr. Miller was the head botanist, a woman in her 50s with gray hair and kind eyes. She brought Sarah Kim, another graduate student, plus Mike Rodriguez from the ecology department and Dr. Patterson, who studied fungi. Good people. Smart people. I should have sent them home immediately. The growth patterns you described in your report are fascinating. "Doctor," Miller said as we unloaded their gear. "Plants don't usually coordinate their behavior like this." "They do if something's controlling them," I muttered, but she didn't hear me. That first night, We had dinner around the research station's big table. Everyone was excited about the work ahead. Sarah kept talking about her thesis on mountain plant communities. Mike wanted to study how the drought was affecting the ecosystem. Dr. Patterson was interested in the fungal networks that connect forest plants underground. None of them noticed how quiet the forest was outside. No bird songs. No insect noises. Just silence. Around midnight, Sarah woke me up. "Rebecca, you need to see this." I followed her outside. She had a flashlight pointed at the tree line, about 50 yards away. At first, I didn't understand what she was showing me. Then I saw them moving. The vines were coming toward us. Slowly, like snakes sliding through the grass. They moved when our flashlight wasn't pointed directly at them, freezing when the light hit them. Sarah grabbed my arm. "They've been doing this for an hour," she whispered, moving closer every time I look away. We watched for another 20 minutes. The vines crept forward inch by inch, stopping just at the edge of the cleared area around the station. When dawn came, they retreated back into the forest. In the morning light, they looked like normal plants again. But I knew better now. The forest was definitely watching us. "Did you see anything strange last night?" I asked the others at breakfast. Dr. Miller shook her head. "Slept like a baby. This mountain air is wonderful." Mike hadn't noticed anything either, only Dr. Patterson looked thoughtful. "I did hear some odd sounds," he said. "Like rustling, but there wasn't any wind." Sarah and I exchanged glances. We knew what we'd seen, even if the others didn't believe us yet. We spent that day collecting samples from the strange circular patches of healthy plants. Every time I knelt down to dig up specimens, I felt like the forest was holding its breath. The vines seemed to watch me work, their leaves turning to follow my movements. Dr. Miller was amazed by what we found. "These root systems are incredible," she said, examining a sample under her portable microscope. "They're all connected underground, like a giant network. Like a nervous system," Sarah added quietly. That evening, Mike went out to check his ecological survey equipment. He should have been back in an hour. When he didn't return by dark, we went looking for him. We found his gear scattered along a deer trail, about half a mile into the woods. His notebook was torn apart, pages scattered everywhere. But there was no sign of Mike himself. Dr. Patterson found something else. "Look at this," he said, pointing his flashlight at the ground. The earth was disturbed in a perfect circle, about 10 feet across. Fresh dirt had been turned over, like something had been buried there, or like something had come up from underground. In the center of the circle, a single flower bloomed, beautiful and white, the size of a dinner plate. It shouldn't have been able to grow that big, that fast. As we watched, it slowly turned to face us, following our movements like an eye-tracking prey. That's when Dr. Miller finally understood. "We need to get out of here," she whispered, "right now." But as we turned to head back to the station, we found our path blocked. Vines had grown across the trail while we stood there, thick as cables and covered in thorns. They shifted slightly in the still air, reaching toward us with obvious hunger. We were trapped in the woods with something that was definitely not just a plant. We tried cutting through the vines with Mike's machete, but they grew back faster than we could hack them down. Worse, the cuts oozed a red sap that looked too much like blood. Every time we damaged the plants, we could hear something like a low moan echoing through the forest. "This way," Dr. Patterson called out. He'd found a gap between two large oak trees that wasn't blocked by vines. We pushed through, branches catching at our clothes and hair. The forest felt alive around us, really alive. Leaves rustled without any wind. Flowers turned to track our movement. Root systems pulsed under our feet like giant veins. And everywhere, that sweet, sickly smell of something rotting. Sarah stumbled and fell. When she tried to get up, thin green shoots had already grown through the laces of her boots, anchoring her to the ground. Dr. Miller and I pulled her free, but more plants kept reaching for her feet. "They're trying to keep us here," Sarah gasped. We made it back to the research station, but barely. The building was surrounded by a thick wall of vegetation that hadn't been there that morning. Vines covered the windows. Tree branches pressed against the roof. We had to fight our way through to reach the front door. Inside, I tried the radio, dead static. The phone line had been cut, or more likely, eaten by something. Our jeeps were buried under a mound of fast-growing brush, We were completely cut off from the outside world. "What do we do now?" Sarah asked. Before I could answer, we heard Mike screaming. The sound came from somewhere deep in the forest, echoing off the cliff walls. Not just pain, pure terror. It went on for almost a minute, then stopped suddenly. The silence afterward was worse than the screaming. Dr. Miller was pacing around the station's main room, trying to make sense of what was happening. "Plants don't behave this way," she kept saying. "They can't coordinate attacks. They don't hunt. These ones do," I said. Dr. Patterson was studying his fungal samples under the microscope. His face had gone very pale. "You need to see this," he called us over. Under the lens, the fungal networks looked like tiny brains. They pulsed with electrical activity, sending signals back and forth in complex patterns. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the human DNA Dr. Patterson had found mixed in with the plant material. "It's learning from us," he said quietly. "Every time it feeds on someone, it gets smarter." That's when we heard Mike calling for help again. This time, his voice was coming from right outside the station. We looked through the windows and saw him standing at the edge of the clearing. He looked normal, except for his eyes. They were completely green now, the color of deep forest moss. And, when he smiled at us, his teeth had turned into thorns. "Let me in," he said in Mike's voice. "I'm hurt. I need help." "That's not Mike anymore," I whispered. Sarah started crying. "Doctor." Miller put her arm around the girl's shoulders, but I could see her hands shaking. The thing that looked like Mike kept talking. "The forest doesn't want to hurt you," it said. "It just wants to help you become part of something bigger, something better." As it spoke, flowers began blooming all around it. Beautiful, impossible flowers in colors that don't exist in nature. The smell was overwhelming, sweet and rich, and somehow hungry. "Don't listen, Doctor," Patterson warned. "The spores, they're affecting our brains. I could feel it working on me already." The flowers were so pretty. Mike looked so peaceful. Maybe being part of the forest wouldn't be so bad. Maybe it would be wonderful, never being alone again, always connected to something vast and ancient and alive. I shook my head hard, trying to clear the thoughts that weren't my own. That's when the real Mike's body stumbled out of the woods behind the false one. The real Mike was wrapped in vines from head to toe, still alive but barely human anymore. His skin had turned green. Roots grew from his arms and legs. His mouth moved, but only leaves came out. The thing wearing Mike's face turned to look at the real Mike, and for just a second, its smile slipped. That's when I saw what was really underneath, not Mike at all, but something made of twisted wood and thorns, puppeting his appearance like a mask. "You see?" it said, the voice starting to sound less human. "He's so much happier now. You could all be this happy." More shapes emerged from the forest. Sarah's missing hiking partner from last month. A Forest Service worker who disappeared 3 years ago. All of them green-skinned and vine-wrapped, all of them smiling with thorn teeth. We were looking at everyone the forest had taken, and now it wanted us too. "Doctor." Miller grabbed the emergency flare gun from the supply cabinet. "Fire," she said grimly. "Plants are afraid of fire." She shot a flare through the window. It hit the false Mike in the chest, and he went up like dry kindling. But instead of screaming, he laughed as he burned. And the laugh came from everywhere at once. The trees, the ground, the walls of the station itself. "Fire won't stop me," the forest said in 1,000 voices. "I've been here for 10,000 years. I'll be here for 10,000 more." That's when I remembered the Cherokee stories my grandmother used to tell. Stories about the Green Mother who fed on the unwary. Stories about ancient bargains and blood sacrifices. I thought I knew what we were dealing with now. But knowing didn't make it any less terrifying. The fire spread faster than it should have, racing through the undergrowth toward the research station. But this wasn't normal fire. It burned green and cold, and the plants it touched didn't die. They changed, becoming something worse. Flowers with mouths full of teeth. Trees with eyes in their bark. Grass that reached up like grasping fingers. "The basement," I shouted. "There's an old storm shelter down there." We grabbed what supplies we could and ran downstairs. The basement was carved from solid rock, part of the mountain itself. I hoped that might protect us from whatever was happening outside. Dr. Patterson was getting sicker. The spores he'd breathed earlier were taking effect. and green veins were spreading up his arms. He kept muttering about the underground network, how it connected every plant for miles around. "It's not separate plants," he whispered. "It's one thing, one huge organism that's been growing under the mountains for thousands of years." Sarah found something in the old files I kept down there, a folder of Cherokee oral histories that a tribal elder had given me when I first arrived. Most of it was about medicinal plants and seasonal ceremonies. But one story made my blood freeze. The Green Mother, the plant spirit that had ruled these mountains before humans came. Every 50 years or so, when she got hungry, she would wake up and feed. The Cherokee had learned to make bargains with her, offer her something, and she would sleep again. "What kind of bargains?" Dr. Miller asked. I kept reading, my hands shaking. Blood. They gave her blood and other things. In exchange, she only took a few people each generation instead of everyone. Above us, we could hear the forest moving. Roots pushed through cracks in the foundation. Vines slithered down the stairs. The whole building creaked and groaned as plants grew through the walls. "There," Sarah said, pointing to a passage near the end of the story. "It says there's a place deep in the mountains, a grove where the first bargain was made. If someone goes there willingly, they can renew the agreement." "What does that mean, exactly?" Dr. Miller asked. I knew, but I didn't want to say it. Someone had to offer themselves to the Green Mother. Someone had to become part of her, feed her, keep her satisfied so she'd leave everyone else alone. Dr. Patterson laughed, but it sounded more like leaves rustling. "Too late anyway. She's too awake now, too hungry. She won't stop until she's fed properly." The lights went out. In the darkness, we could hear something large moving upstairs. Heavy footsteps that shook dust from the ceiling. But they didn't sound like feet, more like massive roots, pulling themselves across the floor. "There's another way out," I said, remembering the old mine shaft that connected to the basement. "It leads deeper into the mountain." We felt our way through the darkness to a wooden door I'd never opened. Behind it was a tunnel carved from living rock, sloping down into the heart of the mountain. The air that flowed up from below smelled like earth and growing things, and something else, something ancient and patient and very much alive. We didn't have a choice. Behind us, the basement ceiling cracked as roots punched through. Ahead of us was only darkness and the unknown. We started walking down into the mountain. The tunnel went deeper than I'd expected, twisting and turning through natural caves. Our flashlights showed walls covered in strange patterns not carved by humans, but grown into the rock by some plant I'd never seen before. The patterns pulsed with faint bioluminescence, like veins full of green blood. Sarah grabbed my arm. "Do you hear that?" I listened. From somewhere far ahead came a sound like singing. Not human voices, but something older. The mountain itself, humming with life. The tunnel opened into a vast underground chamber. Our lights couldn't reach the far walls, but we could see the center clearly enough. A massive tree grew there, its trunk so wide it would take 50 people holding hands to circle it. Its roots spread across the floor like arteries, disappearing into cracks in the stone. Its branches reached up into darkness above, and hanging from those branches were people, dozens of them, wrapped in glowing pods like giant fruit. Some looked fresh. Others had been there for years, maybe decades. All of them were still alive, their faces peaceful, their bodies slowly being absorbed into the tree itself. "The feeding chamber," Dr. Patterson whispered. He was mostly green now, more plant than human. "This is where she digests her food." At the base of the great tree sat an old Cherokee man. He looked up as we approached, unsurprised to see us. "You're late?" he said simply. "I've been waiting." His name was Joseph Crow Feather, and his family had been the keepers of the old bargain for 5 generations. Every Cherokee elder knew this place existed. They'd been watching the signs, waiting for the Green Mother to wake up again. "The agreement was broken 50 years ago," he explained. "White settlers drove my people away before the feeding time came. She's been getting hungrier ever since." "What do we have to do?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Joseph stood up slowly. He was old, maybe 90, but his eyes were sharp and clear. "Someone has to take my grandfather's place. Someone has to feed her properly so she'll sleep again." Behind us, roots burst through the tunnel entrance. The Green Mother had found us. Vines thick as tree trunks poured into the chamber, reaching for us with obvious hunger. But they stopped just short of the great tree, forming a circle around us. "She's waiting," Joseph said. "The choice has to be made freely." I looked at what was left of my team. Dr. Miller was crying. Sarah looked terrified but determined. Dr. Patterson was barely human anymore, green sap oozing from his skin. The vines crept closer. In the distance, I could hear more voices calling hikers, campers, anyone unlucky enough to be in the forest when the Green Mother woke up. She was gathering her feast. I thought about all the people who would die if we didn't do something. All the families who would never know what happened to their loved ones. All the searchers who would come looking and never leave these mountains again. I stepped forward toward the great tree. "I'll do it," I said. The moment I touched the ancient tree's bark, everything changed. I could feel the Green Mother's consciousness flowing into mine. 10,000 years of patient growth, of watching seasons turn, of slow hunger growing in the darkness under the mountains. She wasn't evil, she was just alien, operating by rules that human minds could barely understand. But Joseph Crowfeather had taught his family well. Through the connection, I felt the old agreements, the careful balance that had kept the peace for centuries. The Green Mother would feed, yes, but only what was offered freely. In return, she would protect the forest and everyone who respected her domain. The tree's roots wrapped around my legs, but gently. I felt my consciousness expanding, connecting to every plant in the mountain range. Oak trees and mountain laurel, wildflowers and moss, fungi and ferns, all part of one vast living network. It was beautiful and terrible and overwhelming. "Not all of you." Joseph's voice came from far away. "Just enough to seal the bargain." The roots stopped at my knees. The Green Mother took what she needed, some of my blood, some of my life force, some of my humanity, but left me mostly intact. I was changed, yes, but still myself, still Rebecca. The other vines retreated. Dr. Miller and Sarah were free to go. Even Dr. Patterson began to look more human as the forest's hunger was satisfied. But I had to stay. The agreement required a keeper, someone to maintain the balance between the human world and the plant kingdom. Joseph was too old to continue the role. The family was scattered. It fell to me now. The government cover-up happened within days. The EPA declared the area contaminated by chemical spills. The Forest Service blocked all the trails. Official reports blamed everything on illegal dumping and toxic exposure. Dr. Miller and Sarah were treated for chemical poisoning. Their memories of the supernatural events explained away as hallucinations. I was transferred to a new position, officially, a botanical research station monitoring environmental contamination. Unofficially, I became the guardian of an ancient secret. The changes in me weren't obvious at first. Green patches on my skin that I could pass off as fungal infections. An ability to sense plant distress from miles away. The need to spend several hours each day in direct sunlight. My aging slowed down, my senses sharpened, my understanding of the forest deepened. I can still do my job as a botanist, but now I do it with knowledge that most scientists would never, I believe. I know which plants are just plants, and which ones are part of something larger. I can feel the Green Mother's moods, her satisfaction when hikers treat the forest with respect, her growing irritation when they don't. Sometimes I have to intervene. When developers try to clear-cut protected areas, I find ways to stop them. When tourists venture too far off the marked trails, I guide them back to safety. When researchers get too curious about the restricted zones, I redirect their attention elsewhere. The Cherokee Nation knows what I am now. Joseph's great niece visits me every few months, bringing traditional tobacco and checking on the old agreements. She's learning the stories, preparing to take over when I can no longer fulfill the role. Because one day, decades or maybe centuries from now, I'll join the others hanging from the great tree's branches. That's part of the bargain too. But until then, I keep the peace between two worlds that were never meant to coexist easily. Most nights, the forest is quiet. But sometimes, when the moon is dark and the air is still, I can hear the Green Mother stirring in her underground chamber. Roots shifting, branches growing, ancient hunger patient but never truly sleeping. And sometimes, late at night when I'm alone at the research station, I feel her gratitude flowing through the network of roots and fungi that connects us. She's not evil, just old and alien and very, very hungry. The agreements keep us all safe, human and plant alike. But I know that 50 years from now, when a new generation has forgotten the old stories, she'll wake up fully again. Someone else will have to make the choice I made. Someone else will have to feed the mountain's harvest. I just hope they're as ready as I was to pay the price for everyone else's safety. The forest remembers everything, and now so do I. My name is Ezekiel Mountaineer, but everyone calls me Zeke. I've been a forest ranger for 12 years now, working the Cherokee National Forest in Tennessee. The Great Smoky Mountains have been my beat, my home, and sometimes my nightmare. People think being a ranger is all about helping lost hikers and putting out campfires. But in these mountains, especially in the deep hollows where roads don't go and cell phones don't work, my job is different. I hunt down the illegal stills. Moonshine operations. It's been cat and mouse for over a century between the law and the mountain families who make their living from corn liquor. I used to work for the ATF before this. Alcohol, tobacco, and firearms. Spent 5 years busting drug operations and illegal weapons. But something about these mountains called me back. Maybe it was growing up here. Maybe it was wanting to understand the people instead of just arresting them. The summer of 1976 was brutal. Hot and dry like the mountains were holding their breath. Perfect weather for making moonshine. The drought meant the corn crops were small, so families who'd been making legal money farming had to go back to the old ways. Back to the stills hidden in caves and valleys their granddaddies used. I'd mapped every known still site in my territory. The Hawkins family up on Copper Ridge, the Masons down in Turkey Creek, the Sullivans who moved their operation every few months like ghosts. I knew their tricks, hidden trails marked with stones, lookouts posted at road bends, stills that could be broken down and moved in an hour. But I'd never run into anything like what I found in Whiskey Hollow. The call came in on a Tuesday morning in July. Sheriff Baker from Sevier County was on the radio, his voice tight with something that might have been fear. "Zeke, you need to get down to the Caldwell place. We got reports of a massive operation, bigger than anything we've seen." The Caldwells had been making moonshine for 3 generations. Silas Caldwell started during the Depression when people were starving and corn liquor was worth more than food. His son Robert kept it going through the war years. Now Robert's boy Tommy was running things, though word was the old man Silas still called the shots. I'd never bothered the Caldwells much. They kept to themselves, didn't cause trouble in town, and their moonshine was just for local folks. Not like some operations that shipped to the cities and brought in organized crime. "What makes this one different?" I asked Sheriff Baker. "Volume," he said. "We're getting reports they're producing 200 gallons a day. That's impossible with the equipment they've got. But the whole county is talking about Caldwell Shine. Says it's like nothing they've ever tasted. 200 gallons a day was factory levels. You'd need a massive operation, dozens of workers, and enough corn mash to feed a small army. The Caldwell place was just a family compound with maybe 6 people living there. I loaded my truck with camping gear and surveillance equipment. If they were running something that big, I'd need to watch for days to figure out how they were doing it. The road to Whiskey Hollow was barely 2 ruts in the dirt, winding through pine forests so thick the sun barely touched the ground. The air got colder as I drove deeper into the mountains, even though it was the hottest day of the year down in town. My radio crackled with static and went dead. Nothing unusual about that. These hollows were radio dead zones. But something felt wrong from the moment I turned onto the Caldwell Road. The forest was too quiet. No birds, no insects. Even the wind seemed to avoid this place. I parked my truck a mile from the compound and hiked in on foot. The trees got bigger and older the deeper I went, like this part of the mountain had been forgotten by time. Spanish moss hung from branches like funeral cloth. The air smelled wrong too. Sweet and sharp, like fruit left too long in the sun. Through my binoculars, I could see the Caldwell compound in the valley below. 3 houses built around a central yard, outbuildings that could hide equipment, and smoke rising from the tree line behind the houses. Not much smoke, barely visible, but constant. That should have been my first clue that something was very wrong. Every moonshiner I'd ever tracked produced clouds of smoke from their fires. You needed massive heat to run a still, and massive heat meant massive smoke, but the Caldwells were producing almost none. I made camp on a ridge overlooking the valley and settled in to watch. As the sun went down, I started seeing lights moving through the trees behind the compound. Not flashlights, something that glowed blue and cold, like foxfire or swamp gas. That's when I heard the music. The music started just after midnight. Fiddle and banjo, but played in a way that made my skin crawl. Too fast, too perfect, like the musicians never needed to breathe or rest. It echoed through the hollow in a way that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. I'd grown up with mountain music. My grandmother played fiddle at church socials. But this was different. The melody was familiar, something I'd heard before, but twisted into something that hurt to listen to. Through my night vision scope, I watched figures moving around the compound. More people than lived there. Way more. They moved in patterns around the buildings, carrying things I couldn't quite make out. Sometimes they'd stop and stand perfectly still for minutes at a time, like they were listening to something I couldn't hear. Around 3 a.m., the music stopped. The figures disappeared. The lights went out. But the smell got stronger. That sweet, sharp scent that reminded me of overripe fruit and something else. Something that made me think of my grandmother's funeral parlor. I dozed fitfully until dawn, and when I woke, the valley looked normal again. Chickens pecking in the yard, laundry hanging on lines, an old man sitting on the porch of the main house, whittling. That had to be Silas Caldwell. Even from a distance, I could see he was ancient, bent and weathered like a piece of driftwood. But something about the way he held his head, scanning the mountains like he was looking for something specific, made me uneasy. I spent the morning watching through binoculars. Normal family activity. A woman hanging laundry, a younger man working on a truck engine, kids playing in the yard. Nothing that suggested a massive moonshine operation. But around noon, vehicles started arriving. Not cars or trucks, but expensive sedans and even a limousine. City cars that had no business on these mountain roads. They parked behind the houses where I could barely see them. Men in suits got out. Business types who looked like they'd never seen dirt before. They carried briefcases and metal containers that looked like milk jugs. They stayed for maybe an hour, then left with their containers full. That's when I knew this wasn't a normal moonshine operation. Normal customers came in pickup trucks and left with mason jars. These people were buying by the gallon and paying enough to afford chauffeurs. I needed to get closer. The forest around the compound was old growth, with trees big enough to hide behind and thick enough canopy to block the view from below. I worked my way down the ridge, using game trails and creek beds to stay hidden. The smell got stronger as I got closer. Sweet and sharp, but now I could identify the other scent underneath. Sulfur. Like someone had been burning matches, but more intense. It made my eyes water and my throat burn. I found the still by following the smell. It was hidden in a grove of massive oak trees about a quarter-mile behind the houses. But what I saw there made no sense. The still was tiny, maybe the size of a coffee pot. But next to it were dozens of barrels, all full. Fresh barrels with new moonshine, and the shine itself glowed, actually glowed, with a soft blue light that seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. There was no fire under the still, no source of heat at all. But steam was rising from the copper tubing, and fresh liquor was dripping into a collection jar. The still was running itself. I crouched behind a tree and watched for an hour. Nobody came to tend the still. Nobody checked the fire that wasn't there. Nobody moved the full barrels or brought new corn mash. But the operation kept running, producing gallons of glowing moonshine with no human intervention. That's when I saw him. He was standing about 20 feet from the still, perfectly still between two oak trees. A tall man in an expensive suit, but the suit looked old-fashioned, like something from the 1930 seconds. His hair was slicked back with pomade, and he wore a bow tie that was perfectly straight. But his eyes were wrong. They glowed the same blue as the moonshine, and when he turned his head to look directly at me, I felt like ice water had been poured down my spine. He smiled, and his teeth were too white and too sharp. "Afternoon, Ranger Mountaineer," he said, and his voice carried perfectly across the distance, even though he was barely speaking above a whisper. "I've been expecting you." I drew my service weapon, but my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold it steady. "Don't be alarmed," the man said, taking a step toward me. "I'm just a businessman. Same as any other entrepreneur in these mountains. Although I suppose my supply chain is somewhat more reliable than most." He gestured toward the still, and I saw something that made my knees weak. The copper tubing wasn't connected to anything. The steam was rising from nowhere, and the moonshine was materializing in the collection jar like water from a magic spring. "Who are you?" I managed to ask. "Friends call me Mr. Barley," he said. "I've been working with the Caldwell family for many years, helping them maintain their competitive edge in a challenging market." The sulfur smell got stronger, and I realized it was coming from him. Not from his clothes or something he was carrying, but from his skin, like it was seeping out of his pores. "The Caldwells are running an illegal operation," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "I'm going to have to shut this down." Mr. Barley laughed, and the sound echoed through the trees like breaking glass. "Oh, Ranger, you have no idea what you're dealing with. This isn't just moonshine. This is liquid inspiration, liquid dreams, liquid souls." He picked up one of the mason jars, filled with glowing moonshine, and held it up to the light filtering through the trees. The liquid moved like it was alive, swirling and pulsing with its own internal light. "One sip," he said, "and a man never wants anything else, never needs anything else. It becomes his whole world, his whole reason for living." I backed away, keeping my gun trained on him, but he just smiled wider. "You can't arrest me, Ranger. I haven't broken any laws. At least, not any laws that your courts would understand." That's when I heard footsteps behind me. I spun around and saw Tommy Caldwell emerging from the trees. He was a young man, maybe 25, with the lean build of someone who worked hard for a living. But his eyes had the same haunted look I'd seen in drug addicts. "He's right," Tommy said, and his voice was flat and lifeless. "You can't stop this. Nobody can. It's been going on too long." "Tommy," I said, recognizing him from old arrest photos, "you don't have to do this. Whatever deal your family made, there's always a way out." Tommy laughed, but there was no humor in it. Just pain and exhaustion. "My grandfather made a deal 40 years ago," he said. "During the Depression, we were starving, and Mr. Barley offered to help. Said he could make our moonshine the best in the mountains. All we had to do was give him what he wanted in return." "What did he want?" Tommy looked at Mr. Barley, and I saw something that might have been fear flicker across his face. "Our souls," he whispered. "One from each generation. Payment for services rendered." That night, I sat in my truck a mile from the compound, radio crackling with static, trying to figure out how to report what I'd seen. How do you tell your supervisor that you found a moonshine operation run by the devil himself? I'd grown up in these mountains, heard all the old stories. Deals with the devil, supernatural bargains. But I'd never believed them. I was a law enforcement officer. I dealt in facts and evidence, not folklore and superstition, but I'd seen the impossible still with my own eyes. Seen moonshine that glowed like captured starlight. Met a man who smelled like sulfur and had eyes that burned like coals. Around midnight, I saw lights moving through the forest again. But this time, I was ready. I had my camera with infrared film and my night vision scope. If something supernatural was happening, I was going to document it. I worked my way back down to the still site, moving carefully through the darkness. The music had started again, that twisted fiddle and banjo melody that seemed to come from the trees themselves. But now I could hear voices too, singing in harmony, but the words were in a language I didn't recognize. The clearing around the still was full of people, more than could possibly live in the compound. Men and women in clothes from different time periods. Some wore Depression-era work clothes. Others were dressed like they were from the 1800s. A few wore modern clothes, but their faces were wrong, pale and expressionless, like they were sleepwalking. They moved in a circle around the still, carrying mason jars of glowing moonshine. As they walked, they took sips from the jars, and each sip made them glow brighter. Their skin took on the same blue light as the liquor, until they looked like living lanterns. Mr. Barley stood in the center of the circle, conducting the ceremony like a preacher at a revival meeting. But instead of calling people to salvation, he was calling them to something else entirely. "Drink deep," he called out, his voice carrying over the music. Drink and forget your sorrows. Drink and forget your pain. Drink and forget yourselves. One of the figures in the circle collapsed. An old woman in a flour sack dress that looked like it was from the 1940 seconds. The blue light faded from her skin, and she lay still on the ground. But Mr. Barley just smiled and gestured for the circle to continue. Payment rendered, he said. Contract fulfilled. Two of the other figures picked up the old woman's body and carried it away into the trees. She was completely limp, but I could see her chest rising and falling. She wasn't dead, but something had been taken from her. Something essential. I tried to take pictures, but my camera wouldn't work. The flash wouldn't fire, and the film advance lever was stuck. My night vision scope showed only static when I pointed it at the ceremony. Whatever was happening down there, it didn't want to be recorded. That's when I noticed one of the figures in the circle was staring directly at me. A young man in modern clothes, maybe 30 years old. He broke away from the circle and started walking toward my hiding spot. As he got closer, I could see his face clearly. His features were slack and empty, like someone had erased his personality and left only the basic functions running. But his eyes were aware, terrified and pleading, like he was trapped inside his own body. "Help me," he whispered when he reached the tree I was hiding behind. "Please, I can't stop drinking it. I can't stop coming here. It's been 3 months, and I can't remember my name anymore." "What's your—" I whispered back. He stared at me for a long moment, his face screwed up in concentration. I don't know. I remember I had a wife. Kids. But I can't see their faces. All I can see is the blue light. All I want is another drink." Before I could respond, he turned and walked back to the circle, his movements mechanical and puppet-like. He took another sip from his mason jar, and the blue light flowed back into his skin. I'd seen enough. This wasn't just illegal moonshine production. This was something that was destroying people's minds and souls. I had to get help, even if nobody would believe my report. I started backing away from the clearing, but I stepped on a dry branch. The crack echoed through the forest like a gunshot. The music stopped. Every figure in the circle turned to look in my direction. Their glowing eyes created dozens of blue pinpoints in the darkness, like stars fallen to earth. Mr. Barley smiled, and his voice carried clearly through the silent forest. "Ranger Mountaineer, how good of you to join us. I believe it's time we had a proper conversation." I ran. I'm not ashamed to admit it. I'd faced down armed drug dealers and desperate criminals, but this was something beyond my training or experience. I crashed through the forest, branches tearing at my clothes, guided only by instinct and terror. Behind me, I could hear them following, not running, but walking with steady, implacable steps. The blue lights moved through the trees like a constellation of hunting wolves. I made it back to my truck and tore out of there, gravel spraying and engine roaring. But in my rearview mirror, I could see the lights still following me. Moving faster than any human could walk, keeping pace with my truck even as I hit 40 miles per hour on the winding mountain road. The lights followed me all the way to the county line, then disappeared like someone had blown out a candle. When I reached the sheriff's station, it was almost dawn. Sheriff Baker took one look at my face and poured me a cup of coffee without asking questions. "Rough night?" he said. I told him everything, the impossible still, the glowing moonshine, the ceremony in the forest, Mr. Barley and his supernatural business arrangement, the people trapped in some kind of addictive trance. Baker listened without interrupting, his face getting more skeptical with every word. "Zeke," he said when I finished, "you've been working too hard. These mountain hollows can play tricks on your mind, especially at night. Why don't you take a few days off, get some rest?" "I know how it sounds," I said, "but I saw what I saw. There are people in danger up there, American citizens being held against their will. By the devil? By someone who claims to be the devil. Whether he's supernatural or just crazy doesn't matter. He's hurting people." Baker sighed and leaned back in his chair. "Tell you what, give me one piece of physical evidence. One photograph. One sample of this glowing moonshine. Anything I can put in a report that won't get me laughed out of the state capitol." That's when I realized my problem. I had no evidence. My camera had malfunctioned. I hadn't brought back any samples. All I had was a story that sounded like the ravings of someone who'd spent too much time alone in the mountains. But I knew what I'd seen, and I knew people were in danger. "I'm going back," I said. "The hell you are. Not alone anyway." Baker stood up and reached for his gun belt. "If there's really something going on up there, we'll handle it properly. By the book. But we're going in daylight, with backup, and we're treating this as a normal moonshine bust until proven otherwise." I wanted to argue, but I knew he was right. Whatever Mr. Barley was, he was operating through the Caldwell family moonshine business. We could bust them for illegal alcohol production and worry about the time of mothers. Supernatural elements later. But as we prepared for the raid, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking into something far more dangerous than a simple criminal operation. Something that had been growing in power for 40 years, feeding on human souls like a parasite. Something that wouldn't give up its prey without a fight. We hit the Caldwell compound at noon with 4 deputies and a federal warrant. The daylight made everything look normal again. Just a poor mountain family trying to make a living the only way they knew how. But when we searched the outbuildings, we found evidence that made no sense. Hundreds of empty mason jars, all with traces of that blue residue. Business ledgers showing sales that would require industrial-level production. And customer lists with names from across 3 states. Tommy Caldwell sat on his porch and watched us work. He didn't resist or try to run. Just sat there with that hollow look in his eyes, like he was waiting for something. "Where's the still?" I asked him. "You already know," he said. "You saw it last night." Sheriff Baker looked at me sharply, but I pressed on. "Where's your grandfather? Where's Silas?" "He's with Mr. Barley, discussing the terms of our contract renewal." "What contract?" Tommy looked at me like I was a child asking where babies come from. "The contract that's kept this family alive for 40 years. The contract that's about to claim its payment." That's when I heard the fiddle music again. Faint, coming from the direction of the still site. But it was broad daylight. The ceremony wasn't supposed to happen until after midnight. "Something's wrong," I told Baker. "We need to get these people out of here." But when I turned around, the deputies were gone. Just vanished, like they'd never been there. Baker was still beside me, but his face was blank and expressionless. His eyes had started to glow with that familiar blue light. "The contract must be honored," he said in a voice that wasn't quite his own. "Payment must be rendered." I drew my gun, but Baker was faster. He moved with inhuman speed, knocking the weapon from my hand before I could react. His strength was impossible, like he'd been possessed by something much stronger than a human body should contain. "One soul from each generation," he said, advancing on me with mechanical steps. That was the agreement. "But the Caldwell line is ending. Tommy has no children, no heirs, so Mr. Barley has decided to expand his collection." I ran toward the forest, hoping to reach my truck. But the woods were full of people now, customers from the ceremony, all glowing with that blue internal light. They emerged from behind trees and out of creek beds, forming a circle around me. At the center of the circle stood Mr. Barley, wearing the same 1,932nd suit, but looking somehow more solid than before. More real. Like he was drawing power from all the souls he'd collected. "Welcome to the graduation ceremony, Ranger Mountaineer," he said. "You've been investigating my business for several days now. It's time you understood the full scope of our operation." He gestured, and the forest around us changed. The trees grew taller and older, their trunks twisted into impossible shapes. The sky darkened to the color of old blood, and the air filled with smoke that smelled like burning souls. "This is what these mountains looked like when I first arrived," Mr. Barley said. "Before the Cherokee, before the Europeans, before humans learned to make corn liquor and opened a doorway I could slip through." The still appeared in the clearing, but now it was massive. A towering copper construction that looked like a cathedral made of distillation equipment. Steam rose from its peaks like incense, and the blue light that flowed through its tubes was bright enough to hurt my eyes. "For 300 years, I've been perfecting my recipe," Mr. Barley continued. "Not just corn liqueur, but liquid addiction, liquid despair, liquid surrender. One sip, and a human soul becomes as malleable as warm clay." Around the clearing, I could see the people from the ceremony, but now I could see them clearly. They weren't people anymore. They were hollow shells, their souls extracted and stored in mason jars that lined shelves built into the massive still. Each jar glowed with its own blue light, and I could see faces in the liquid. Faces that were screaming silently, trapped in eternal torment. The Caldwell family provided the infrastructure, Mr. Barley said. The knowledge of moonshine production, the customer base, the legitimate business front. In exchange, I provided them with prosperity beyond their wildest dreams. But the payment was always their souls, I said, one per generation. Grandfather Silas paid first, during the Depression. His soul is in that jar there. He pointed to a shelf high on the still. His son, Robert, paid during the war years. His soul is there as well. And now Tommy? Tommy has been reluctant to honor the family contract. He seems to think there should be a way out. But contracts written in blood and sealed with sulfur are binding for eternity. That's when I saw him. Tommy Caldwell, standing at the base of the massive still. But he wasn't possessed like the others. His eyes were clear and desperate, and he was holding something in his hands. A sledgehammer. "You want my soul?" Tommy shouted, raising the hammer above his head. "Then you'll have to take it from me." He brought the hammer down on the base of the still with all his strength. Copper pipes cracked and blue liquid sprayed everywhere. The sound was like a church bell breaking, a deep, resonant tone that seemed to shake the mountain itself. "Mister." Barley's confident smile disappeared. "Foolish boy," he snarled. "You cannot destroy what has been built with supernatural power." But Tommy kept swinging. Each blow sent cracks running up the sides of the still. Blue light leaked out like glowing blood, and the faces trapped in the mason jars began to move more frantically. "The still is the anchor," Tommy shouted to me over the sound of cracking copper. "Destroy the original still, and the contract is void." I understood. The tiny still I'd seen in the forest wasn't just producing moonshine. It was the physical anchor that allowed Mr. Barley to exist in our world. Without it, he'd be pulled back to whatever hell he'd crawled out of. I rushed to help Tommy, grabbing a piece of broken pipe and using it as a crowbar. Together, we attacked the supernatural distillery with everything we had. Mr. Barley screamed in rage and lunged at us, but each blow we struck made him less solid. His fine suit began to smoke and char. His handsome face started to melt like wax in a fire. "You don't understand what you're doing," he shrieked. "Without my product, the mountains will fall back into poverty. The old ways will return. Families will starve." "Maybe," Tommy said, bringing his hammer down on the main copper column. "But they'll starve as free men, not as slaves to your addiction." The still collapsed with a sound like thunder. Copper pipes exploded, releasing torrents of blue light that shot up into the sky like reverse lightning. The mason jars shattered, and the trapped souls were released in a column of pure white light that pierced the dark sky. Mr. Barley's scream cut off abruptly. His body began to dissolve, starting with his feet and working upward. The expensive suit crumbled to ash. The perfect hair caught fire. The burning amber eyes went out like snuffed candles. "This isn't over," he whispered as his head began to fade. "There are other mountains, other families, other contracts to be written." Then he was gone, leaving nothing but the smell of sulfur and the sound of wind through broken copper. The possessed people around the clearing collapsed like marionettes with cut strings. But they were breathing, alive. The blue light faded from their eyes, replaced by confusion and pain, but humanity had returned to their faces. The forest returned to normal. Regular trees under a regular sky. The massive supernatural still was gone, leaving only a small pile of corroded copper that looked like it had been buried for decades. The official report listed the Caldwell incident as an industrial accident. Illegal distillery explosion. 1 fatality. Silas Caldwell, whose body we found in the ruins. Several people treated for chemical exposure and disorientation. The supernatural evidence was classified by federal authorities who arrived the next day. Men in black suits who asked very specific questions and took away anything that glowed blue. They spoke to each witness individually, and somehow everyone's memory of the events became fuzzy and uncertain. Everyone except mine and Tommy's. Tommy Caldwell disappeared 3 days after the incident, left a note saying he needed to make sure no one else in his family would ever be tempted to make the same deal his grandfather had made. Last I heard, he was working on a fishing boat in Alaska, as far from the mountains as he could get. The people who'd been addicted to the supernatural moonshine recovered slowly. Most had no memory of the months or years they'd spent under Mr. Barley's influence. They returned to their families confused but grateful, like survivors of a strange plague. The traditional moonshine families went back to their normal operations. Small stills hidden in hollows, producing liquor for local consumption. The quality was ordinary, but it was honest work done by free people. I transferred to a new division that doesn't officially exist. We investigate supernatural crimes across the Appalachian region. Turns out Mr. Barley wasn't unique. There are things in these old mountains that feed on human weakness and desperation. Entities that have learned to hide behind traditional practices and cultural blind spots. But now we know how to spot them, how to fight them, how to break contracts written in blood and sealed with sulfur. I still patrol the Cherokee National Forest, but my jurisdiction has expanded. I look for stills that produce too much with too little. Families that prosper too quickly after generations of poverty. People who disappear into the mountains and come back changed. Because Mr. Barley was right about one thing. There are other mountains, other families, other contracts waiting to be signed by people desperate enough to trade their souls for temporary prosperity. And sometimes, on hot summer nights when the air is still and the mountains hold their breath, I can smell sulfur on the wind. I can hear fiddle music playing songs that hurt to listen to. The moonshine devil is gone, but the things he taught are still out there, waiting for the next person willing to make a deal that sounds too good to be true. Because in these mountains, it always is. My name is Ezekiel Mountaineer, and I hunt monsters that hide behind mason jars and copper stills. It's not the job I thought I'd have when I became a forest ranger, but it's the job these mountains need. And God help me, it's the job I was born to do. My name is Alex Redwolf, and I've been a ranger in the Chattahoochee National Forest for 16 years. In all that time, I've seen people get lost, hurt, and sometimes killed by these mountains. Bears, cliffs, sudden storms, haunted. Georgia's wilderness doesn't forgive mistakes. But what I found last Tuesday morning on Blood Mountain changed everything I thought I knew about what hunts in these woods. I'm part Cherokee on my mother's side, though I never paid much attention to the old stories growing up. My dad was practical, said believing in spirits and curses was just superstition. I became a ranger because I love these mountains and I'm good at finding people when they get in trouble. I know every trail, every cave, every stream between here and the Tennessee border. At least, I thought I did. The call came in at dawn. 5 hunters from Atlanta hadn't checked in with their families. Their trucks were still at the Blood Mountain trailhead, but they'd missed their planned return by 2 days. Sheriff's Department wanted me to take a look before calling in the search and rescue teams. Blood Mountain is the highest peak in Georgia, rising over 4,400 feet above sea level. The Cherokee used to call it something else, a name that meant where the earth bleeds. Most people don't know that. They just know it's a challenging hike with great views. The Appalachian Trail runs right over the summit, and there's an old stone shelter where hikers spend the night. I started up the main trail just after sunrise. October weather in the mountains can change fast, and there was already a chill in the air that made me zip up my jacket. The leaves were turning, brilliant reds and golds that tourists come from all over to see. Everything looked normal at first. Then I found their camp. It was about 3 miles up, in a clearing beside Turner Creek. 5 tents arranged in a perfect circle around a cold fire pit. Their gear was still there. Expensive rifles, coolers, full of food, sleeping bags laid out neat as you please. But no sign of the men anywhere. I called out, my voice echoing off the rocky slopes. Forest Service, anyone here? Nothing but wind in the trees. That's when I noticed the tracks. Boot prints leading away from camp, all 5 men walking together toward the old Cherokee ceremonial ground. I'd been to that spot once before, years ago, with a tribal elder who was helping with a historical survey. It was a sacred place. A circle of ancient stones where warriors used to hold rituals before battle. The tracks were easy to follow at first. 5 sets of hiking boots, size 10 to 12, moving in single file up a deer trail. But something bothered me about the way they walked. The spacing was too perfect, like they were marching. And there were other prints mixed in, something that looked almost like wolf tracks, but bigger than any wolf I'd ever seen. I radioed back to headquarters. "This is Red Wolf. Found Hunter's camp, but no sign of them. Following tracks toward the old ceremonial site. Request backup." The radio crackled with static. "Copy that, Alex. How's it look?" "Strange," I said, studying those oversized paw prints. "Real strange." As I climbed higher, the forest got quieter. No bird songs, no squirrel chatter. Even the insects seemed to have gone silent. The temperature dropped another 10 degrees, and fog started rolling in from the north. These mountains have their moods, but this felt different. It felt like the whole forest was holding its breath. The ceremonial ground sat on a flat shelf of rock about halfway to the summit. As I approached through the thick pines, I could smell something wrong on the wind, something that made my stomach turn, and my Cherokee grandmother's warnings echo in my head. I pushed through the last screen of rhododendron bushes and stopped dead. The 5 hunters were there, all right, but they weren't hunting anymore. The scene in that ancient stone circle will haunt me for the rest of my life. The 5 men lay arranged like points of a star, their feet pointing toward the center where someone had built a small fire. Their hunting rifles were gone. Their hearts had been cut out with surgical precision, and their blood had been used to paint symbols on the standing stones, symbols I recognized from my grandmother's stories about the old ways. I'd seen death before. Car accidents, hunting mishaps, heart attacks on the trail, but this was something else entirely. This was ritual. This was ceremony. This was murder with a purpose I didn't want to understand. My hands shook as I called it in. "Headquarters, this is Red Wolf. I need the sheriff, the coroner, and the Georgia Bureau of Investigation up here right now. We've got 5 bodies." "Jesus, Alex, what happened?" I looked around the stone circle, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. "I don't know, but someone who knows Cherokee War, Customs did this." While I waited for backup, I walked the perimeter of the ceremonial ground. More of those oversized tracks circled the area. Whatever made them had been watching, waiting. The prints were too big for any wolf in Georgia, and they showed an intelligence in their pattern that made my skin crawl. The sheriff arrived first, red-faced and breathing hard from the climb. Tom Bradley had been running law enforcement in this county for 20 years, but I could see this was beyond anything he'd dealt with before. "Good God Almighty," he wheezed, staring at the bodies. "What kind of sick bastard does something like this?" "Someone who knows the old Cherokee ways," I said. "These symbols, the arrangement of the bodies, that it's traditional warrior ritual." "You saying some Indian did this?" "I'm saying someone with knowledge of Cherokee ceremony did this. Could be anyone who studied the culture." But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't that simple. The precision, the understanding of the sacred geography, TBI. This felt like something deeper. The GBI agents arrived an hour later, followed by the coroner and a crime scene team. They photographed everything, measured everything, bagged and tagged everything. But I could tell they were just as confused as the rest of us. Agent Sarah Mills pulled me aside as they were finishing up. She was a sharp woman from Atlanta, with the kind of professional competence that usually impressed me. Today, she just looked tired and frustrated. "Mr. Red Wolf, you've been working these mountains for 16 years. You ever see anything like this before?" "No, ma'am, nothing even close." "Any idea who might have this kind of knowledge about Cherokee rituals?" I thought about it. Maybe someone from the tribal council, a few academics at the university. But honestly, this level of detail, you'd need to learn it from an elder, someone who carries the old stories. She nodded, making notes. "We'll need you to help us understand the cultural aspects. Can you translate these symbols?" I looked at the blood-painted stones again. War symbols, death symbols, and one I'd hoped never to see, the mark of the Blood Mountain curse, the one my grandmother whispered about when she thought I wasn't listening. "Some of them," I said. "But Agent Mills, you might want to talk to someone from the Cherokee Nation about this. This isn't just murder. This is something older." The bodies were removed by late afternoon, but I stayed behind to walk the area one more time. That's when I found the trail. More of those oversized tracks, heading up toward the summit. But these were different. They started as paw prints, but gradually changed, becoming more and more human with each step, like whatever made them was transforming as it walked. I followed the trail for about a quarter mile before I lost it on the rocky ground near the peak. But I found something else that made my blood run cold. Claw marks on a huge oak tree 8 feet off the ground. Whatever had made those marks was big enough to reach that high while standing on its hind legs. As the sun set behind the western ridges, I made my way back down to the ceremonial ground. The crime scene tape fluttered in the evening breeze, and the bloodstains on the stones looked black in the fading light. That's when I heard it, a howl from somewhere up the mountain. Long, mournful, and somehow intelligent. It wasn't like any wolf or coyote I'd ever heard. It sounded almost human, like someone crying out in a language I should have understood but didn't. I reached for my radio, then stopped. What was I going to say? That something was howling on the mountain? That was normal. What wasn't normal was the way it made me feel. Like something was calling my name. Like something knew I was there and wanted me to answer. The howl came again, closer this time. And in the silence that followed, I swear I heard footsteps circling the ceremonial ground. Heavy steps that paused at each stone, as if checking the symbols painted there. I drew my sidearm and backed toward the trail, every instinct screaming at me to run. But as a ranger, I'd sworn to protect these mountains and the people in them. Even if I didn't understand what was hunting here, I couldn't just walk away. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice steadier than I felt. "This is a crime scene. You need to leave the area." The footsteps stopped. For a long moment, the only sound was wind in the pines and my own hammering heartbeat. Then, from the darkness between the trees, came a voice that chilled me to the bone. "Alexander Redwolf," it said in perfect English. "Son of James, grandson of Mary Walking Bear. I have been waiting for you." The voice was male, deep and rough, with the faint accent of someone who had learned English as a second language. But there was something else in it, an age and sadness that seemed to echo from the mountains themselves. "Who are you?" I managed to ask. "I am the one your grandmother told you about in her stories. I am the debt that must be paid. I am the blood that calls for blood." A figure stepped into the clearing, and my world changed forever. The man who emerged from the shadows stood nearly 7 feet tall, with long black hair and the weathered features of someone who had spent a lifetime outdoors. He wore traditional Cherokee clothing, buckskin leggings, a war shirt decorated with beadwork, and a bone choker around his throat. But it was his eyes that stopped my breath, yellow eyes that reflected the moonlight like an animal's. "Do not reach for your weapon, Red Wolf," he said, raising one hand. "I did not come here to harm you, not yet." "You're under arrest for murder," I said, but my voice cracked. Something about this man made every instinct in my body scream danger. He laughed, a sound like wind through dry leaves. "Murder? I prefer to call it justice. Those 5 men carried the blood of Captain Joshua Whitman, as do you." The name hit me like a physical blow. My great-great-grandfather, the one my family never talked about, the military officer who had served in Georgia during the 1,830 "I don't know what you're talking about," I lied. "Your ancestor led the soldiers who burned my village in 1838. He killed my wife, my children, my parents. He forced my people from these sacred mountains at gunpoint, driving them west to die on the Trail of Tears." The man's voice remained calm, but I could see rage building behind those yellow eyes. "I've hunted his bloodline for over a century. You are the last." "That's impossible. The Trail of Tears was in 1838. That's over 150 years ago. Time moves differently for those of us who cannot die," he said. "I am Ayana Screaming Eagle, warrior of the Cherokee, bound by sacred oath to avenge my people. A dying medicine man cursed me to hunt Captain Whitman's descendants until justice is done." As he spoke, I watched his features begin to change. His face elongated, his teeth became fangs, and his fingernails grew into claws. The transformation was gradual but unmistakable. This man was becoming something else. "You're insane," I whispered, but I was backing away. "Am I?" He gestured toward the blood-stained stones. "Then explain what you found here. Explain the tracks you followed. Explain how 5 armed men died without firing a shot." I couldn't. Nothing about this made sense according to the world I thought I knew. But the evidence was right in front of me, and standing 10 feet away was something that shouldn't exist. "What do you want?" I asked. "What I have always wanted, justice for my people, blood for blood." But you are different from the others, Alexander Redwolf. You carry Cherokee blood as well as Whitman's. That complicates things. The transformation continued. His spine curved, forcing him to hunch forward. His arms grew longer, more muscled. When he smiled, I saw rows of predator's teeth. I'm going to give you a choice, he said, his voice becoming deeper, more guttural. Meet me on the summit at the next full moon. Come alone, armed with whatever weapons you choose. Face me in single combat as your ancestors should have faced me in life. If you win, the curse ends. If I win, you'll kill me. I will free you from the burden of your bloodline, and then I can finally rest. With that, he dropped to all fours and completed his transformation. The man became a massive wolf-like creature, 8 feet long and covered in dark fur. Those yellow eyes remained intelligent, watching me with an expression that was almost sad. Then he turned and loped into the forest, moving with impossible speed over the rocky ground. I stood alone in the ceremonial ground for a long time, trying to convince myself that what I'd just seen was a hallucination brought on by stress and shock. But the claw marks on the trees were real. The dead hunters were real. And somewhere in my family's carefully buried history was a truth I'd never wanted to face. The next morning, I drove to the Cherokee Reservation 2 hours south of the forest. I needed answers, and I knew where to find them. Joseph Running Bear was the oldest man I'd ever met, well into his 90s and still sharp as winter wind. He served as the tribal historian and keeper of the old stories. When I told him what had happened on Blood Mountain, he listened without interruption, his weathered face growing more troubled with each detail. "Iona Screaming Eagle," he said finally. "I hope that story was just legend. You know about him? My grandfather told me the tale when I was young. During the removal, there was a warrior who refused to leave. He fought the soldiers until they cornered him at the sacred spring near Blood Mountain. They shot him down while he was trying to protect his family." Joseph paused, staring out the window at the rolling hills of the reservation. As he died, the medicine man Standing Wolf placed a curse on the soldiers and their bloodlines. He bound Iona's spirit to the mountain, gave him the shape of the wolf, and charged him with hunting those responsible for our people's suffering. "And you believe this actually happened?" The old man looked at me with eyes that had seen too much. "Son, my people have lived in these mountains for thousands of years. We know things about this land that your science cannot explain. If Iona Screaming Eagle has returned, then the debt must be paid. But I didn't do anything. I wasn't even born when the Trail of Tears happened." "Blood calls to blood," Joseph said. "In Cherokee law, the sins of the fathers become the burden of the children. Your ancestor, Captain Whitman, was responsible for great suffering. Until someone from his bloodline acknowledges that pain and makes amends, the curse will continue. How do I fight something like that?" Joseph was quiet for a long time. Then he reached into an old wooden chest and pulled out something wrapped in deerskin. "My grandfather gave this to me, said it would be needed someday. I never thought that day would come." Inside the wrapping was a tomahawk, its steel head engraved with Cherokee symbols and its handle carved from mountain ash. The weapon felt balanced and deadly in my hands. "This was blessed by Standing Wolf himself," Joseph explained. "It's the only thing that can harm Iona's spirit form. But remember, he's not evil, just bound by duty. If you can find another way to satisfy the curse, you might not need to use it." I left the reservation with more questions than answers, and 3 weeks until the full moon. But I also left with something else, a growing understanding of the weight my family had carried for generations without knowing it. Back on Blood Mountain, I started Droll Mountain, It Is No Changes to Teen Mount, preparing for what might be my last night alive. The full moon rose over Blood Mountain like a cold white eye, casting everything in silver light. I'd spent 3 weeks researching my family history, learning Cherokee traditions, and training with the blessed tomahawk Joseph Running Bear had given me. But as I climbed toward the summit for what might be my final confrontation, I felt woefully unprepared to face a supernatural being that had been hunting my bloodline for over a century. I reached the ceremonial ground just before midnight. The crime scene tape was gone, but the bloodstains on the ancient stones remained. Someone had cleaned off the symbols, but I could still see faint traces where they'd been painted. "You came," said a voice from the darkness. Iona Screaming Eagle stepped into the moonlight, back in his human form but somehow more imposing than before. He'd painted his face with white clay in traditional war markings, and eagle feathers hung from his hair. In his hands, he carried a war club carved from hickory and set with sharp flint blades. "I gave you my word," I said, gripping the tomahawk's handle. "Your ancestor never kept his word. He promised our people safe passage to the reservation, then drove us from our homes like cattle." Ayana's yellow eyes reflected the moonlight. "But you are here, so perhaps honor runs in the Cherokee blood you carry." "I've been learning about what happened during the removal," I said, "about Captain Whitman and the soldiers under his command. What they did to your people was wrong." "Wrong?" Ayana's voice rose. "They murdered children. They burned our sacred places. They forced pregnant women to march through winter snow until they died on the trail. Wrong is too small a word for what they did." He was right. In 3 weeks of research, I'd learned terrible things about my ancestors' role in the Cherokee removal. Captain Joshua Whitman had been particularly brutal, even by the standards of his time. He'd burned villages that had already surrendered, separated families, and shown no mercy to the sick or elderly. "I know," I said, "and I'm sorry. I'm sorry for what he did, sorry for the pain he caused, sorry that it took 150 years for someone in my family to acknowledge it." "Sorrow does not restore the dead to life," Ayana said, but I heard something different in his voice. "Sorrow does not undo the suffering." "No, but it's a start. My ancestor was a monster, and his crimes were covered up by history, but they don't have to stay buried." I told him about the research I'd been doing, the documents I'd found in military archives, the testimony from Cherokee survivors that had been ignored for generations. I told him about my plans to work with Joseph Running Bear and other tribal historians to ensure the true story of the removal was told. "The Cherokee Nation is seeking federal recognition for sites like this one," I continued, gesturing to the stone circle around us. "I can help with that. I can make sure Captain Whitman's crimes are documented and acknowledged." For the first time since I'd met him, Ayana looked uncertain. "You would dishonor your own bloodline?" "I would honor the truth. Isn't that what justice really means?" He studied me for a long moment, the war club held loosely in his hands. "Pretty words, Alexander Redwolf. But I have heard pretty words before. I have waited 150 years for justice. Words are not enough. Then what is?" Instead of answering, he began to change. The transformation was faster this time, more violent. Bones cracked and reformed, muscles bulged and shifted, and the man became something that was neither fully human nor fully wolf. He stood 9 feet tall on legs that bent wrong, with arms that ended in claws longer than my fingers. "Combat?" he growled in a voice that barely sounded human. "The old way, warrior to warrior. If you can defeat me, the curse ends and my spirit finds peace. If I kill you, then your bloodline pays its debt and I am free to rest." There was no more time for talking. The beast that had been Ayana's screaming eagle lunged at me with supernatural speed, claws extended and fangs bared. I rolled to the side, barely avoiding those deadly claws, and swung the tomahawk in a wide arc. The blessed weapon caught him across the ribs, drawing black blood and eliciting a howl of pain and rage. At least the Cherokee magic worked. But he was incredibly fast and stronger than anything I'd ever faced. His next attack sent me flying backward into one of the standing stones. Stars exploded behind my eyes, and I tasted blood in my mouth. The beast pressed his advantage, slashing with claws that could have torn me in half. I managed to block with the tomahawk's handle, the impact driving me to my knees. Up close, I could see the intelligence in those yellow eyes. This wasn't just an animal attacking, but a skilled warrior, using supernatural abilities. We fought across the ceremonial ground, trading blows that would have killed any normal opponent. The blessed tomahawk was the only thing keeping me alive, its Cherokee magic allowing it to wound the creature when nothing else could. But I was human, and he was something far beyond human limitations. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, I found myself backed against the central fire pit, bleeding from a dozen claw marks and barely able to lift the tomahawk. The beast stood over me, breathing hard but clearly victorious. "It is finished," he said, his voice a rumbling growl. "You fought with honor, but the debt must be paid." "Wait," I gasped. You said you've been bound by this curse for 150 years. Don't you want it to end? I want justice for my people. And I want to help you get it. Not just acknowledgement of what happened, but real action. Land returned to the Cherokee Nation. Federal protection for sacred Dodd. The sites. Educational programs, so this history is never forgotten again. The beast paused, claws raised to deliver the killing blow. But I can't do any of that if I'm dead, I continued. And you'll still be bound to this mountain, hunting the next generation of Whitman descendants. The curse will never end until someone breaks the cycle. For a long moment, we stared at each other in the moonlight. Then, slowly, the creature began to change back into human form. When the transformation was complete, Ayanna stood before me as a man again. But he looked older somehow, more tired. There is another way, he said reluctantly. The medicine man Standing Wolf gave me a choice when he bound my spirit. I could hunt the Whitman bloodline until all were dead, or I could find one worthy to take my place as guardian of the sacred places. Guardian? Someone to protect what remains of Cherokee heritage in these mountains. Someone to ensure the old stories are remembered and the sacred sites are respected. He looked at me with those ancient eyes. Someone who carries both Whitman blood and Cherokee blood, who understands the weight of history. I understood what he was offering. A chance to break the cycle of vengeance, but at a cost I wasn't sure I was ready to pay. What would that mean for me? You would gain abilities like mine, the power to take wolf form, enhanced senses, a lifespan measured in centuries rather than decades. But you would also be bound to these mountains, responsible for protecting them until someone else worthy comes along. It was an impossible choice. Give up my human life to become something I didn't fully understand, or watch the cycle of vengeance continue to the next generation. But as I looked around the ancient ceremonial ground, thinking about the 5 dead hunters and all the pain that had brought us to this moment, I realized there was really only one choice I could live with. I accept, I said. The transformation happened at dawn. As the first rays of sunlight touched the mountain peaks, Ayanna placed his hands on my shoulders and spoke words in Cherokee that seemed to echo from the stones themselves. I felt something ancient and powerful flow into me, changing me at a level deeper than blood or bone. The physical changes were subtle at first. Enhanced hearing that let me distinguish individual heartbeats from miles away. Vision sharp enough to see a mouse moving through underbrush in complete darkness, and an awareness of the forest that was almost telepathic. I could sense every living thing on the mountain, from the smallest insect to the largest bear. But the most profound change was spiritual. I could feel the presence of Cherokee ancestors in the wind, hear their voices in the rustle of leaves, and understand my connection to this land in a way I'd never imagined possible. The curse is broken, Ayanna said, and for the first time since I'd met him, he smiled. After 150 years, I can finally rest. What happens to you now? I go to join my family in the spirit world, but my work here continues through you. He gestured to the mountains around us. These are sacred places, older than the cities and towns that have grown around them. As guardian, you must protect them from those who would exploit or desecrate them. As the sun rose higher, Ayanna began to fade like morning mist. But before he disappeared completely, he left me with final words of guidance. Remember, Alexander Redwolf, justice is not the same as vengeance. What we accomplished here today was justice. The truth will be told, the wrongs will be acknowledged, and the sacred places will be protected. That is how we honor both the living and the dead. Then he was gone, leaving me alone on Blood Mountain as the first guardian it had known in over a century. The months that followed changed everything. Working with Joseph Running Bear and other Cherokee historians, I helped document Captain Whitman's crimes and present them to federal authorities. The evidence was overwhelming, and it led to formal acknowledgement of the atrocities committed during the Cherokee removal. More importantly, it led to action. The federal government granted the Cherokee Nation co-management authority over several sacred sites in the Chattahoochee National Forest, including Blood Mountain. Educational programs were established to teach the true history of the removal, and funding was provided for Cherokee cultural preservation efforts. I remained a forest ranger, but my role expanded. Officially, I became the liaison between the Forest Service and the Cherokee Nation. Unofficially, I became something much more and to speak. A bridge between the modern world and ancient traditions. between scientific understanding and spiritual wisdom. My enhanced abilities proved useful in ways I hadn't expected. I could track lost hikers across terrain that would stump bloodhounds, sense approaching storms hours before weather services detected them, and communicate with the wildlife in ways that helped me protect both animals and humans. But perhaps most importantly, I could ensure that what happened to those 5 hunters never happened again. The cycle of vengeance was broken, replaced by a commitment to healing and justice that honored both Cherokee heritage and the complexity of history. On quiet nights, when the moon is full and the mountain wind carries the voices of ancestors, I sometimes wonder if I made the right choice. I gave up the possibility of a normal human life. Marriage, children, growing old, surrounded by family. Instead, I accepted a responsibility that may last for centuries. But then I think about Ayanna's screaming eagle, finally at peace after 150 years of being bound by duty and pain. I think about the Cherokee children who will grow up knowing their true history and the sacred places that will be protected for future generations. I think about the 5 families who now have answers about what happened to their loved ones, and the healing that comes from truth-telling. The Blood Mountain stalker is gone, but the mountain's guardian remains. And as long as these peaks rise above the Georgia wilderness, someone will be watching over them, ensuring that the old stories are remembered and the sacred places are honored. Sometimes, on clear mornings when the mist rises from the valleys below, I can hear children's laughter carried on the wind. Cherokee children visiting the ceremonial ground with their elders, learning about their heritage in a place that was nearly lost forever. That's when I know I made the right choice. The blood debt has been paid, not with more death, but with life. Not with vengeance, but with justice. And in the ancient stone circle where 5 men died and a century-old curse was broken, the spirits of the Cherokee ancestors rest peacefully at last, knowing their sacred mountain is protected. But I've learned that some responsibilities never truly end. They just pass from one guardian to the next, carrying forward the wisdom of the past and the hope of the future. And somewhere in these mountains, if you know how to listen, you can still hear the old stories being told. Stories of justice, healing, and the power of choosing love over hate. My name is Alexander Redwolf, and I am the guardian of Blood Mountain. This is my story, but it's not the end. It's just the beginning of something new. My name is Diana Wolfsbane, and I've spent 14 years studying every snake, lizard, and salamander that calls the Virginia mountains home. From tiny brown snakes no bigger than earthworms to 6-foot timber rattlers, I thought I knew them all. I was wrong. It was late May 1992 when I first came to Mount Rogers with my graduate student Sarah Chen. The Forest Service had asked me to survey the reptile populations in the high meadows between 44s. Some rare salamanders hadn't been seen in years, and they wanted to know if the species was gone for good. Mount Rogers sits in Jefferson National Forest, the highest peak in Virginia at over 5,700 feet. Up there, the trees give way to open grasslands called balds. Tainous, strange, beautiful meadows that shouldn't exist at that elevation. Cherokee people used to say the balds were sacred places where the spirit world touched ours. I didn't believe in spirits back then. I believed in science. Sarah and I set up our research station in an old cabin 25 miles from the nearest town. No phone, no electricity, just us and the mountains. Perfect for scientific work, I thought. Sarah was excited, a 24-year-old biology student from Richmond who'd never spent serious time in the wilderness. She kept talking about how peaceful it was, how the air felt different up there. "Dr. Wolfsbane," she said on our 3rd morning, sorting through specimen jars. "Have you ever seen snakeskins this big?" I looked at what she was holding. It was definitely a shed snakeskin, but something was wrong with it. The skin was nearly 3 feet long and wide enough that Sarah could put her whole hand through it. I'd never seen anything like it from any Virginia snake species. Probably from an escaped pet, I told her, though I didn't believe it myself. Someone released a python or boa when it got too big. But even as I said it, I knew that wasn't right. The scale pattern was wrong for any python I'd ever seen. The scales were too uniform, too perfectly formed. And there was something else. a shimmer to the skin, like oil on water, that made it hard to look at directly. Sarah found 2 more skins over the next few days, each one larger than the last. By the end of the week, we had 5 shed skins ranging from 3 to 8 feet long. I sent photos to colleagues at Virginia Tech and the Smithsonian. Nobody could identify the species. Maybe it's a new species, Sarah suggested. Something that's been hiding up here for years. I laughed, but not unkindly. Sarah, we've cataloged every reptile in Virginia. There's no unknown giant snake living in these mountains. That's when the weather started acting strange. We'd been having perfect spring days, sunny, mild, with light breezes, but on our 8th day, the barometer in our equipment kit started going crazy. The needle swung back and forth like something was playing with it. Our radio crackled with static even when no stations were broadcasting. The temperature jumped from 65 degrees to 85 degrees in less than an hour, then dropped back down just as fast. Electromagnetic storm? I told Sarah, though I'd never seen one behave like this. Mountain weather can be unpredictable. Sarah nodded, but I could see she was getting nervous. She kept looking over her shoulder when we hiked, like something was watching us. I blamed it on city nerves. Some people never get comfortable in real wilderness. That night, I was writing up my field notes when I heard Sarah talking outside the cabin. Her voice was strange, musical almost, speaking words I didn't recognize. I went to check on her and found her standing in the moonlight, perfectly still, looking up at the sky. "Sarah, you okay?" She turned to me with a smile that didn't look quite right. "Just enjoying the night air, Dr. Wolfsbane. It's so warm out here." But it wasn't warm. The temperature had dropped into the 50s, and I could see my breath. Sarah was standing there in just a t-shirt and jeans, not even shivering. "Let's get you inside," I said, taking her arm. Her skin felt hot, almost feverish. She let me guide her back to the cabin, but as we reached the door, she stopped and looked back toward the tree line. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. I listened. Nothing but normal night sounds. Owls, wind in the trees, the distant call of a coyote. "Hear what?" "Never mind," she said, but her eyes stayed fixed on the dark woods. I must be imagining things. The next morning, Sarah slept until almost noon. When she finally got up, she moved differently. Slower, more graceful, like she was underwater. Her appetite had changed too. She barely touched the oatmeal I made for breakfast, but when I offered her some leftover beef jerky, she ate the entire bag. "Feeling okay?" I asked. "Better than okay," she said. "I feel different, more alive somehow." We spent the day checking our salamander traps in Wilburn Creek. The water was crystal clear and ice cold, perfect habitat for the rare mountain salamanders we were looking for. But the traps were empty, and that bothered me. In 14 years of fieldwork, I'd never seen habitat this good with no amphibians at all. "It's like they all left," Sarah said, trailing her hand in the water. "Or something scared them away." As we worked our way upstream, I started noticing other strange things. No bird songs, no insect buzzing. The forest was absolutely silent except for the sound of water over rocks. Even the fish were gone. Wilburn Creek should have been full of native brook trout, but I didn't see a single one. We were about 2 miles from the cabin when Sarah found it. "Dr. Wolfsbane," she called from behind a massive boulder. "You need to see this." I climbed over the rock to find Sarah standing at the entrance to a cave I'd never noticed before. The opening was about 6 feet high and perfectly round, like someone had drilled it into the mountainside. Warm air flowed out of it, carrying a strange, musky smell. "This wasn't on any of our survey maps," I said, pulling out my GPS unit. According to the coordinates, we were standing in solid rock. Sarah was already walking toward the cave entrance. "There's light coming from inside," she said. "And listen, do you hear that sound?" I followed her, and yes, there was something breathing. A low, rhythmic noise like breathing, but too deep and too slow for any animal I knew. The cave stretched back into darkness, but about 20 feet in, there was definitely a glow coming from somewhere deeper in the mountain. "We should go back," I said. "Get proper equipment, flashlights, safety gear." But Sarah was already walking into the cave. "Just a quick look," she called back to me. "I'll stay where you can see me." I watched her silhouette move deeper into the tunnel. The warm air kept flowing past me, and with it came that smell. Not quite snake, not quite something else. Something old and wild and definitely alive. "Sarah, that's far enough." She didn't answer. I could barely see her now, just a shadow against that strange, pulsing glow. "Sarah!" A sound echoed from deep in the cave. Not Sarah's voice, but something that might have been trying to sound like her voice. The words were English, but the tone was all wrong. Too deep, with odd pauses between syllables. "Come, deeper. Diana, come. See." That's when I ran. I scrambled back over the boulder and sprinted down the creek bed, not caring about scientific protocol or equipment or anything except getting away from that cave. I didn't stop running until I reached the cabin. Sarah came back 3 hours later, just as the sun was setting. She looked perfectly normal, except for her eyes. The pupils were huge, black circles that didn't shrink even in bright light. "Where were you?" I demanded. "I've been worried sick." "Exploring the cave," she said calmly. "It's amazing down there, Dr. Wolfsbane. There are chambers that go back for miles. And the formations, crystals like I've never seen." "Sarah, you were gone for 3 hours with no equipment, no backup. That was incredibly dangerous." She smiled that not quite right smile again. "I wasn't alone." "What do you mean you weren't alone?" "I met someone down there. A local man who knows the cave system. He's been studying the geology for years." I stared at her. "Sarah, we're 25 miles from the nearest road. There's no one else up here." "His name is Thomas," she continued, as if I hadn't spoken. "He's very knowledgeable about the local history. Cherokee legends, old stories about the mountain. He wants to meet you tomorrow." That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the sound from the cave, the way Sarah's voice had echoed back wrong. And her pupils. Dilated pupils could mean head injury, drug exposure, or shock. But she seemed alert and oriented, just different. Around midnight, I heard her talking again outside the cabin. I looked out the window and saw her standing in the same spot as the night before. But this time, she wasn't alone. There was a man with her, tall, dark-haired, wearing what looked like hiking clothes. Even in the moonlight, I could see he was handsome, with strong features and confident posture. They were standing close together, and Sarah was laughing at something he'd said. I grabbed my flashlight and went outside. "Sarah, who's your friend?" The man turned toward me, and for just a moment, his eyes reflected the flashlight beam like an animal's. When he smiled, his teeth looked too white, too sharp. "You must be Diana," he said in a voice like warm honey. "I'm Thomas. Sarah's told me so much about your work." "How did you get up here?" I asked. "There's no road access." "I know these mountains well," he said. "There are many paths if you know where to look." I wanted to ask more questions, but suddenly I felt incredibly tired. My eyelids were heavy, and the flashlight seemed too heavy to hold up. "You should rest," Thomas said softly. "Tomorrow we can talk more about your research. I think you'll find our local reptiles are more interesting than you imagined." The next thing I remember is waking up in my bed the next morning with no memory of going inside. When I woke up, Sarah was already gone. Her bed hadn't been slept in, and her field equipment was missing. I found a note on the kitchen table, written in handwriting that looked like hers, but somehow wasn't quite right. Asterisk. "Gone to collect specimens with Thomas. Back by evening. Don't worry." Times I spent the day trying to radio the Forest Service, but our equipment was completely dead. No static, no power light, nothing. Even the batteries in my flashlight had drained overnight, and they'd been fresh the day before. Without communication and with Sarah missing, I should have hiked out to get help. That would have been the smart thing, the safe thing. But I'm a scientist, and nothing about this situation made scientific sense. I needed answers. I went back to the cave. In daylight, it looked different. Smaller, more natural. The warm air was still flowing out, and that musky smell was stronger than ever. I had backup flashlights and fresh batteries, plus climbing rope and emergency supplies. This time, I was going in prepared. The tunnel sloped downward for about 50 feet before opening into a larger chamber. My flashlight beam revealed walls covered in formations unlike anything I'd seen in other Virginia caves. The rock was smooth, almost polished, and there were patterns in it that looked almost deliberate, spirals and curves that reminded me of scales. That's when I found the first skeleton. It was human, but wrong. The bones were too long, the skull elongated, the rib cage expanded, and the spine, there were too many vertebrae, as if the person had been stretched like taffy. Scattered around the bones were shreds of what might have been clothing and a tarnished metal object I recognized as a Forest Service badge. The date on the badge was 1962. I kept going deeper, following the main passage as it twisted through the mountain. Every few hundred yards I found more bones. All human, all wrong. Some were recent enough that scraps of modern clothing still clung to them. Others were old enough to be archaeological finds. The passage opened into a vast chamber lit by some kind of phosphorescent crystal formations. The crystals pulsed with rainbow colors, creating enough light to see clearly. And what I saw made me drop my flashlight. Eggs, dozens of them, each about the size of a football, arranged in neat rows along the chamber walls. They glowed with the same rainbow light as the crystals, and I could see shadows moving inside them. As I watched, one of the eggs pulsed, and something large shifted within the shell. Beautiful, aren't they? I spun around to find Thomas standing at the chamber entrance, but now I could see him clearly. I realized what had been wrong about him the night before. His proportions were just slightly off, too tall, too graceful, arms and legs a little too long, and when he moved, it was with the fluid motion of something that had no bones. "Where's Sarah?" I demanded. "Safe," he said, stepping into the crystal light. "Transforming, as you will be." "Transforming into what?" He smiled, and this time I could see that his teeth weren't just sharp, they were hollow, like fangs. Something better than human. Something that will help my children inherit the earth they deserve. That's when I saw the shed skins we'd been finding weren't from his prey, they were from him. Thomas wasn't human at all. He was something ancient and powerful that could wear human shape like clothing. The Cherokee called my kind. "Uktena," he said, as if reading my thoughts. "Great serpents who ruled these mountains before your people came. I am the last of my kind, Diana. For 3 centuries, I have slept, waiting for the right conditions to awaken. Your modern world, with its pollution and noise, has finally made the old hiding places untenable." I backed away toward the tunnel entrance, but more shapes emerged from the shadows, things that had once been human but now moved with serpentine grace. Their eyes glowed with the same light as the crystals, and their skin had a scaled, iridescent quality. "My previous mates," Thomas explained casually. "Each one chosen for her intelligence, her strength, her potential to bear strong children. Sarah will join them soon, as will you." "You're insane," I whispered. "Am I? Look around you, Diana. This chamber has been here for 1,000 years. My children sleep in these eggs, waiting for the right time to emerge. When they do, they will be everything. Humanity pretends to be strong, intelligent, perfectly adapted to their environment. They will inherit a world that humans are quickly making uninhabitable for themselves." One of the transformed women stepped forward. I recognized her face from missing person reports I'd seen over the years, a hiker who disappeared in 1988. She opened her mouth to speak, and instead of words, a sound came out like steam escaping from a valve. "The change is not unpleasant," Thomas said gently. "You retain your memories, your personality. You simply become more, faster, stronger, no longer limited by human fragility. Sarah is already beginning her transformation. Soon she will lay the first eggs of the new generation." I ran. I sprinted through that tunnel faster than I'd ever run in my life, flashlight beam bouncing wildly ahead of me. Behind me, I could hear them following, not footsteps, but the sound of scales on stone, getting closer. I burst out of the cave entrance and kept running until I reached the creek. Only then did I stop to catch my breath and think. I had to find Sarah and get us both out of these mountains. But first, I needed help. I remembered what Thomas had said about Cherokee legends. If he was truly something from their old stories, maybe they would know how to fight him. There was a Cherokee community center about 40 miles away in the valley. If I could get there, if I could find someone who still remembered the old ways. But as I started down the trail toward my truck, I heard Sarah calling my name from somewhere in the forest behind me. Her voice sounded perfectly normal, perfectly human, and that's what scared me most of all. I found Sarah sitting by our cabin, looking completely normal, except for the fact that she was sunbathing in 55-degree weather and didn't seem to feel the cold at all. "Diana," she called cheerfully. "Where have you been? I've been looking everywhere for you." I approached carefully, staying far enough away that I could run if I needed to. "Sarah, we need to leave, right now. Pack your things." "Leave? But we haven't finished the survey yet, and Thomas has so much more to show us." Her pupils were still dilated, but worse than that, when she turned her head, I could see small patches of skin on her neck that shimmered with that same iridescent quality I'd seen on the other transformed women. "Sarah, listen to me carefully. Thomas isn't human. He's some kind of creature that's been changing people, turning them into something else. We have to get away from here before he comes back." She laughed, a sound like water over stones. "Thomas told me you might react this way. He said, some people have trouble accepting evolution when they see it happening. This isn't evolution, Sarah. It's parasitism." "Is it? I feel amazing, Diana. Stronger, faster, more aware than I've ever been. Yesterday I could hear your heartbeat from across the cabin. This morning I caught a rabbit with my bare hands, not because I was hungry, just because I could." She stood up with that new fluid grace and walked toward me. I backed away, but she kept coming, smiling that not quite right smile. "He's chosen you too, Diana. He says you have the perfect combination of intelligence and strength. Our children will be magnificent." "Sarah, you're talking about having children with a snake." "With the future," she corrected. "Humans had their chance to take care of this planet. Look what you've done with it. Pollution, deforestation, mass extinction. Thomas's children will do better." I kept backing away until I bumped into my truck. Sarah was close enough now that I could see her skin wasn't just shimmering. It was actually developing tiny scales along her hairline and down her neck. "Don't run, Diana. He'll only have to hunt you down. And that makes the process more difficult. If you come willingly, the transformation is much more pleasant." I fumbled for my truck keys, but Sarah moved faster than should have been possible. Her hand closed over mine, and her grip was incredibly strong. Her skin felt hot, almost burning. "Thomas is waiting for you in the deep chamber," she whispered. "He's prepared a special place for you. You'll love it there. It's warm and safe, and you'll never have to worry about the outside world again." I yanked my hand free and managed to get the truck door open. Sarah didn't try to stop me, just stood there smiling as I gunned the engine and drove away down the mountain road. But I wasn't heading for town. I was heading for the Cherokee Community Center. I found it just before sunset, a low, modern building surrounded by traditional gardens. An elderly man was watering plants outside when I pulled up, my truck rattling from the rough mountain roads. "Excuse me," I called, getting out of the truck. "I need help. It's about Mount Rogers, about something called an uktena." The man dropped his watering can. Water spilled across the concrete, but he didn't seem to notice. "Where?" he asked sharply. "In the caves beneath the peak. There's something there that's been taking people, changing them. A woman named Sarah Chen is missing, and there are others." The man studied my face for a long moment, then nodded. "I'm Joseph Crowfeather. My grandmother told me stories about the uktena, but I never thought, come inside. We need to talk." Joseph led me into the building, past offices and meeting rooms to a small kitchen where he made coffee with hands that shook slightly. "The uktena is old magic," he said. "Older than the Cherokee Nation, older than the mountains themselves. My grandmother's grandmother saw one back in 1890. It took 3 women from our village before the medicine men found a way to drive it back into the deep caves." "How?" I asked. "How did they stop it?" "Sacred plants. 4 medicines that grow only in these mountains. When burned together at the right time, under the right stars, they create smoke that breaks the uktena's hold over human minds. But it's dangerous work. The creature is powerful, and it will fight to protect its territory. I have to try. Sarah is still up there, and God knows how many others." Joseph looked out the window at the darkening sky. "Tonight is the new moon. The alignment is right for the ceremony, but you cannot do this alone. I don't have a choice." "Yes, you do." He stood up and walked to a cabinet, pulling out a small leather pouch. "I will come with you. My grandfather taught me the old ways before he died. It's time to put that knowledge to use." We drove back up the mountain in darkness, Joseph's old pickup following my truck along the winding forest road. He'd brought a bag of supplies, bundles of dried plants I didn't recognize, carved wooden implements, and a rifle that looked like it had seen better days. The rifle probably won't hurt it much, he explained as we parked near the research station, but it might buy us time. The cabin was empty, but there were signs Sarah had been back, muddy footprints tracking through the rooms, and a strange smell like warm earth and musk. Outside, we could see lights moving in the forest, heading toward the cave entrance. It knows we're here, Joseph said. The Uktena can sense disruption in its territory. We need to move fast. We hiked through the darkness toward the cave, guided by Joseph's flashlight and my GPS. The forest felt wrong, too quiet, too warm for a spring night in the mountains. Twice I heard Sarah's voice calling my name from different directions, but Joseph grabbed my arm both times. Not her, he said grimly, the creature learning to use her voice. At the cave entrance, we could see the rainbow glow spilling out into the night. Joseph began unpacking his supplies, spreading the dried plants in a careful pattern around the opening. Once I light these, we'll have maybe 30 minutes before the smoke disperses, he explained. You need to get in there, find your friend, and get out. I'll maintain the ceremony and try to keep the Uktena from following you. What if it kills you? He smiled grimly. Then you'd better run very fast. Joseph struck a match and touched it to the first bundle of plants. Smoke began rising, not the gray smoke of burning leaves, but something white and pure that seemed to glow with its own light. The effect was immediate. From deep in the cave came a sound like nothing I'd ever heard. Rage and pain, and something that might have been fear, all mixed together in a roar that shook the mountain. Go, Joseph shouted over the noise. Find her and bring her back. I ran into the cave as the sacred smoke billowed around me. The smoke followed me down the tunnel, and everywhere it touched, the cave changed. The smooth, scale-like walls became rough, natural stone. The warm air turned cool and damp, and the sounds from deeper in the mountain became more desperate, more angry. I found Sarah in the egg chamber, but she wasn't alone. Thomas was there too, but not in his human disguise. He was enormous, 60 feet of rainbow-scaled serpent coiled around the crystal formations, with a massive horned head and eyes like molten gold. In the center of his forehead was a crystal that pulsed with hypnotic light. Sarah was standing perfectly still in front of him, her eyes fixed on that crystal. As I watched, she was changing, her skin taking on more of that iridescent quality, her limbs becoming longer and more graceful. But the sacred smoke was affecting her too. Every few seconds, she would blink and shake her head, as if waking up from a dream. Sarah, I called. Fight it, remember who you are. The Uktena's head swiveled toward me, and those golden eyes focused on my face. I felt the pull of the crystal immediately, a warm, hypnotic attraction that promised peace and belonging, and an end to all human struggles. For a moment, I understood why the other women had chosen transformation. It would be so easy to just give in, but the sacred smoke was stronger. It burned my nose and throat, but it also cleared my mind. I could think, could choose, could resist. You cannot stop what has already begun. The Uktena spoke, its voice like thunder in the enclosed space. She carries my children now. Soon they will emerge, and this world will know its new masters. Sarah, I called again. Remember, Richmond. Remember your research. Remember why you became a scientist. She blinked again, and this time her eyes focused on me instead of the crystal. Diana? Her voice was her own again, confused and frightened. What's happening to me? I can't remember. There are things in my head that aren't mine. The Uktena moved faster than anything that large should have been able to. Its massive coils swept toward me, but I dove behind one of the crystal formations. The impact shattered stone and sent rainbow light spinning through the chamber. The eggs! Sarah screamed suddenly. Diana, the eggs are hatching! She was right. All around the chamber, the football-sized shells were cracking open. Things emerged that looked like snakes at first. But as they moved into the crystal light, I could see they had tiny human faces and hands. They were beautiful and horrible at the same time. More smoke poured into the chamber from the tunnel entrance. Joseph's ceremony was working, but it was also making the Uktena desperate. The great serpent thrashed wildly, its crystal blazing with hypnotic light. "Take her and go," it roared. "But know that you have only delayed the inevitable. My children will find other mates, other mothers. Humanity's time is ending." I grabbed Sarah's hand and ran for the tunnel. Behind us, the Uctena's roar shook the entire mountain. Rocks fell from the ceiling as we stumbled through the passage, guided by the sacred smoke toward fresh air and starlight. We burst out of the cave to find Joseph maintaining his ritual, the white smoke still rising from the burning plants. His face was drawn with exhaustion, but he managed to smile when he saw us. "The fire department should be here soon," he said. "I called them before we came up, told them there was a gas leak in the cave system. They'll seal the entrance until it's safe." As we drove down the mountain, Sarah fell asleep in the passenger seat. In the rearview mirror, I could see lights blazing from the cave entrance as the fire department arrived. They would seal it, just as Joseph had said. But I knew it wouldn't hold the Uctena forever. 6 months later, Sarah had recovered physically from her ordeal. The scales had faded, her proportions had returned to normal, and the doctors found no trace of whatever had been growing inside her. Psychologically, it took longer. She changed her research focus from field biology to laboratory work, and she never went camping again. I kept working in the mountains, but now Joseph Crow Feather was my unofficial partner. The Forest Service didn't ask questions about why a Cherokee elder had become a consultant on my projects. They just knew that wherever we worked together, we never lost any more researchers. 3 times over the next 2 years, we found cave systems where the walls had that strange, scale-like smoothness. 3 times we performed the sacred plant ceremony and sealed the entrances. Each time, we found evidence of recent human activity, camping gear, abandoned cars, missing person reports that suddenly made sense. The Uctena was still out there, still looking for mates, still dreaming of a world ruled by its hybrid children. But now it had opposition. Now someone was watching. On quiet nights in my cabin, when the wind moves through the trees just right, I sometimes hear sounds that might be very large snakes moving through the forest. And sometimes, if I listen carefully, I can hear voices calling from the darkness. Voices that sound human but somehow aren't quite right. Sarah was right about one thing. We are living through an evolutionary moment. But it's not the evolution the Uctena imagines. It's the evolution of human awareness, human responsibility. We're learning that we share this world with things older and stranger than we ever imagined. My name is Diana Wolfsbane, and I study the things that shouldn't exist but do. It's not the career I planned, but it's the one this world needs. The mountains keep their secrets, but some of us are finally learning to listen. My name is Jonathan Ravencrest, and I've been a ranger at Pisgah National Forest for 13 years. Before that, I taught 3rd grade for 8 years. People always ask why I left teaching to work in the woods. The truth is, I love working with kids, but I needed the mountains. There's something about these old hills that feels like home. I work the Grandfather Mountain area, mostly doing youth education programs. School groups, scout troops, summer camps, you name it. If there are kids involved and they're heading into my part of the forest, I'm usually the guy they call. I know every trail, every creek, every cave worth exploring. More importantly, I know how kids think when they're out here. After 21 years working with children, I can usually predict what they'll do before they do it. That's what made the Girl Scout incident so strange. It was early October, 1983. The leaves were just starting to turn, and the morning air had that crisp bite that makes you want to zip up your jacket. Perfect hiking weather. I was leading 8 Girl Scouts from Asheville on what should have been a simple nature walk. Ages 7 to 10, all experienced hikers with their wilderness badges. Their troop leader, Mrs. Henderson, had been bringing groups up here for 5 years. Nothing about this trip felt different from the hundreds of others I'd done. We started on the Tanauwa Trail around 9 in the morning. The plan was simple. 2-hour hike through the rhododendron thickets, stop for lunch at Rough Creek, then back to the parking area by 3. Easy day. The kind of hike these girls could do in their sleep. The weather was perfect. Clear skies, good visibility, no storm fronts moving in. I checked the radio twice before we left. All clear. The girls were excited but well-behaved, staying on the trail and listening to instructions. Mrs. Henderson walked at the back of the group while I led from the front. Standard procedure. Everything was normal for the first hour. We saw a family of deer, identified different types of oak trees, and the girls collected interesting leaves for their nature journals. They were laughing and chatting like kids do, pointing out cool rocks and asking questions about the Cherokee who used to live in these mountains. Around 10:30, we stopped at a small clearing for a water break. The girls spread out a little, but stayed within sight. That's when I noticed the fog starting to roll in from the valley below. Nothing unusual. These hollows get misty all the time, especially in the morning when the air is cool and the ground is still warm from yesterday's sun. But this fog felt different somehow. Thicker. It moved wrong, like it was flowing uphill instead of settling in the low places where it belonged. I'd seen a lot of mountain weather in 13 years, and this didn't look natural. "Girls, let's pack up," I called. "We're going to head back toward the main trail." That's when I realized I couldn't see them anymore. The fog had rolled in faster than anything I'd ever seen. One minute I could see all 8 girls and Mrs. Henderson clearly. The next minute, I was standing alone in a wall of gray mist so thick I couldn't see my own feet. "Sarah, Emma, where are you?" I shouted. No answer, not even Mrs. Henderson responded. I pulled out my whistle and blew 3 sharp blasts, the signal we'd taught the girls to use if they got separated. Nothing. I tried the radio, but got only static. The fog seemed to swallow every sound I made. I spent the next hour searching that clearing and the area around it. The fog never lifted, never thinned. It just hung there like a gray wall, cutting off the rest of the world. I found the spot where we'd been sitting. I found the backpacks. I found the water bottles. But I never found any sign of where 9 people could have gone in a space the size of a basketball court. By noon, I had called in every available ranger in the district. By 1 o'clock, we had search dogs and volunteers combing the forest. By 3, we had helicopter support and the county sheriff's department coordinating a full search and rescue operation. 9 people don't just vanish from a small clearing in broad daylight. There had to be an explanation. The fog lifted around 2 in the afternoon, as suddenly as it had appeared. One minute we were searching in near-zero visibility. The next minute we had clear skies and perfect weather again. But there was still no sign of the missing group. The search teams spread out in a grid pattern, covering every inch of forest within a 2-mile radius of the clearing. We checked every cave, every creek bed, every fallen log big enough to hide behind. The dogs picked up scent trails leading in multiple directions, but they all just stopped after a few hundred yards, like the people had simply disappeared into thin air. As the afternoon wore on, I started thinking about the Cole families. 8 sets of parents who had sent their daughters on what was supposed to be a safe, easy hike. Mrs. Henderson's husband. How was I going to explain this? How was I going to tell them that I had somehow lost 9 people in a few minutes of fog? At 4:47 p.m., Deputy Martinez's radio crackled to life. "We've got them," came the voice of Ranger Williams from Sector 7. "All 9, alive and well." The relief hit me like a physical blow. I actually had to sit down on a fallen log to catch my breath. "What's their condition?" Martinez asked. "They're fine, tired, hungry, but no injuries. They're asking when they can go home." "Where did you find them?" There was a pause before Williams answered. "That's the weird part. They're at Boone Fork, about 5 miles northeast of the original site." I stared at the radio. Boone Fork was a day's hike from where we'd lost them. There was no way they could have covered that distance in 6 hours, especially not with kids, that young. When we reached the site, all 9 of them were sitting by the creek like they were having a picnic. The girls were laughing and playing with something in the water. Mrs. Henderson was sitting on a rock, looking confused but unharmed. "Where have you been?" I asked as I ran up to them. "Playing," said Emma, the youngest at 7 years old. "We made new friends." "What friends?" I looked around. I didn't see anyone else. "The other kids," said Sarah, who was 10 and usually very serious. "They showed us the best places to find pretty rocks." Mrs. Henderson stood up slowly. "Jonathan, I need to talk to you privately." We walked a few yards away from the group while the other rangers started checking the girls for injuries. "I don't understand what happened," she said quietly. One minute we were in that clearing with you, the next minute we were here. The girls keep talking about other children, but I never saw anyone else. How long do you think you were gone? She checked her watch. That's just it. According to my watch, we've been here for about 12 hours. But that's impossible, right? We started the hike this morning. I looked at my own watch. 5:15 p.m. We'd lost them around 10:30 a.m. 6 hours and 45 minutes. Mrs. Henderson, you've been missing for less than 7 hours. She stared at me. That can't be right. We had lunch here. We played games. We took naps. The girls had time to make friends with whoever those other children were. I walked back to the group. Girls, can you tell me about these other kids you met? They all started talking at once, excited to share their adventure. There was Mary Elizabeth, and she was really nice. And Tommy, and he knew all the best hiding spots. They taught us this really fun game with rocks. They had the prettiest dresses, like from the old days. How many other children were there? I asked. The girls looked at each other, counting on their fingers. Lots, said Emma finally. Maybe 20? Where are they now? They had to go home before dark, Sarah explained. But they said we could come back and play any time. I spent the next hour interviewing each girl separately. Their stories were remarkably consistent, which was unusual for kids that age. Usually, when children make up stories together, the details change with each telling. But all 8 girls described the same things. A group of children in old-fashioned clothing who appeared as soon as the fog rolled in, games that lasted all day, and new friends who seemed to know everything about the forest. The strangest part was their sense of time. Every girl insisted they had been playing for most of the day. They remembered eating lunch, taking breaks, even taking naps in the afternoon sun. But according to our timeline, they had been missing for less than 7 hours. When we got back to the ranger station, I pulled out the Reichenhoffel incident report forms. I'd filled out hundreds of these over the years. Lost hikers, minor injuries, equipment problems, but I'd never had to write a report about 9 people disappearing and reappearing with no memory of how they got from one place to another. I wrote the facts as I knew them. The timeline, the locations, the weather conditions, but I didn't write anything about the other children the girls described. I didn't write about the time discrepancy. I didn't write about the feeling I'd had in that fog, the sense that something was watching me from just beyond the edge of sight. Some things don't belong in official reports. But that night, as I sat in my cabin going over the day's events, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd missed something important. Something that might have explained what really happened in those 6 hours and 45 minutes. The incident should have been closed. The girls were safe, no one was hurt, and there was no evidence of any actual wrongdoing. But I couldn't let it go. Over the next few days, I found myself going back to both locations, the clearing where we'd lost them and the creek where they'd been found. I told myself I was looking for clues, trying to understand how they could have covered that distance so quickly. But really, I was looking for signs of the other children. I found them on my 3rd visit to Boone Fork. Not the children themselves, but evidence they'd been there. Small footprints in the mud near the creek, too small to belong to our Girl Scout group. Stones arranged in careful patterns that hadn't been there before. And strangest of all, flowers woven into tiny crowns and left on flat rocks, like offerings or gifts. I photographed everything, though I wasn't sure why. The footprints were clear enough, but they were old-fashioned somehow. The shoes that made them had smooth soles and pointed toes, not the treaded hiking boots or sneakers that modern kids wore. That weekend, I drove to the local library in Boone and started researching the history of the area. What I found made my hands shake as I read. Children had been disappearing in these mountains for over 200 years. The earliest record I found was from 1783 AT. A 7-year-old Cherokee girl named Little Deer, who wandered away from her family's camp and was never found. Then a settler family in 1802 lost their 5-year-old son during a berry-picking expedition. In 1843, a girl named Mary Elizabeth Cromwell disappeared while playing near her family's cabin. The list went on and on. 23 children in total, all lost in the same general area where our Girl Scout troop had their adventure. Some of the disappearances were explained: bear attacks, falls, getting lost in bad weather. But many were complete mysteries. Children who simply vanished without a trace, leaving behind only grieving families and unanswered questions. I was so absorbed in my research that I didn't notice the librarian standing behind me until she spoke. "Researching the lost children?" she asked quietly. I turned around. She was an elderly Cherokee woman with kind eyes and silver hair braided down her back. "Yes, ma'am. I'm Jonathan Ravencrest, Forest Service Ranger. I'm trying to understand something that happened last week." She sat down across from me. "My name is Ruth Stamper. My great-great-grandmother was Little Dear's cousin. Our family has been keeping track of these stories for a long time." Keeping track? The children who disappear. Sometimes they come back. Not alive, you understand, but they come back. A chill ran down my spine. "What do you mean?" "My grandmother saw them once when she was about 8 years old. She was picking blackberries near Rough Creek when the fog rolled in. She said children appeared out of nowhere, boys and girls in old-fashioned clothes, speaking different languages from different time periods. They wanted her to come play with them. What happened? She ran home and told her parents. They knew the stories, so they kept her away from that area for years. But she never forgot them. She said they looked happy but lonely, like they were waiting for something." Ruth reached into her purse and pulled out an old photograph. This was taken in 1952, during a family reunion at Grandfather Mountain. "Look at the background." I studied the black and white photo. It showed about 20 Cherokee families gathered around picnic tables. But in the background, partially hidden by trees, I could see small figures that didn't quite look right. Children in clothes that seemed older than 1952, watching the families from the edge of the forest. "The Cherokee have always known about the little people," Ruth continued. "But these aren't the same spirits. These are the lost ones, the children who died in these mountains before they could grow up. They're not evil, but they're not at peace either." I thought about our Girl Scout troop, about their consistent stories of playing with children in old-fashioned clothes. "Mrs. Stamper, what do they want?" She was quiet for a long moment. "The same thing any child wants," she said finally. "Someone to play with. The problem is, they don't understand that their games can last forever." That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the girls from our trip, how happy they'd looked when we found them, how they'd talked about their new friends like they'd known them for years, how they'd all insisted the experience had lasted much longer than the 6 hours they'd actually been missing. The next morning, I got a call from Mrs. Henderson. "Jonathan, I need to talk to you about the girls," she said. "Some of the parents are calling me with concerns." "What kind of concerns?" "The girls have been asking to go back to the mountains. Not just asking, begging. Some of them are having dreams about their new friends. And yesterday, Emma's mother found her trying to walk to the forest by herself." I felt that chill again. "I'll be right over." I spent the morning interviewing the parents. The stories were all similar. The girls couldn't stop talking about their experience in the mountains. They drew pictures of children in old-fashioned clothes. They played games they claimed their new friends had taught them. And most disturbing of all, they seemed to have detailed knowledge about historical events they couldn't possibly know. Sarah had started speaking a few words in Cherokee, though she'd never been exposed to the language. Emma knew the words to folk songs that hadn't been popular for 50 years. 2 of the other girls had begun weaving grass into complex patterns that looked exactly like Cherokee baskets. "It's like they brought something back with them," one mother told me, "or like something followed them home." That afternoon, I made a decision that probably should have gotten me fired. I went back to the clearing, where we'd lost the girls, and I went alone. I waited until the fog started rolling in around sunset. This time, I was ready for it. I had my camera, a tape recorder, and enough supplies to last overnight if necessary. I wanted to document whatever was happening in these mountains. I didn't have to wait long. As the fog thickened around me, I started hearing voices. Children's voices, speaking in languages I didn't recognize. At first, they seemed to come from far away, but gradually they got closer. Then I saw them. Children emerged from the fog like they were walking out of another world. Some looked Cherokee, others European. A few appeared to be from African families. Their clothes spanned 2 centuries: buckskin dresses, pioneer bonnets, Victorian party clothes, even a few modern outfits from the 960 seconds and 70 seconds. But they all had one thing in common. They glowed with a soft, pale light that seemed to come from within. At the front of the group was a girl about 9 years old in a brown dress that looked like it belonged in a museum. Her hair was long and blonde, tied back with a ribbon that might have been blue once but had faded to gray. She looked directly at me and smiled. "Are you here to play too?" she asked. I should have been terrified. Everything I believed about the world said that what I was seeing was impossible. But looking at these children, I felt only sadness. They were so obviously lost. "What's your name?" I asked the blonde girl. "Mary Elizabeth Cromwell," she said with a slight curtsy. "I've been waiting here since 1843. 1843. I remembered that name from my research. Mary Elizabeth Cromwell, age 9, disappeared while picking berries near her family's cabin. Never found. Mary Elizabeth, do you know that you died? Her smile faltered for just a moment. We don't use that word here. We just play and wait for our families to come find us. Around her, the other children moved closer. I could see the details of their faces now, the period clothing, the old-fashioned shoes, but I could also see through them, like they were made of mist themselves. Your families have been looking for you, I said gently, but they're not here anymore. They lived their whole lives missing you, and then they died too. That was a long time ago. That's not true, said a boy in overalls who couldn't have been more than 6. My mama is coming back for me. She said she'd only be gone for a little while. How long have you been waiting? He thought for a moment. Since yesterday, I think, or maybe the day before. Mary Elizabeth put her hand on his shoulder. Tommy's been with us since 1923, she explained. Sometimes it's hard to remember how long we've been here. I looked around at all of them, 23 children spanning 2 centuries, all still waiting for someone to take them home. The girls who were here last week, I said. Our Girl Scout troop, you played with them. Mary Elizabeth's face lit up. Oh yes, they were so much fun. It's been so long since we had living children to play with. We taught them our games, and they taught us theirs. They had to go home. We know. But they said they'd come back to visit. Living children always say that. Have other living children found you before? Oh yes, said a girl in a faded yellow dress. Lots of them, over the years. We have such wonderful times together. But they always have to leave. Some of them stayed, Tommy added hopefully. Some of them decided to play with us forever. The chill I'd been feeling turned into ice in my veins. What do you mean, stayed? Mary Elizabeth looked uncomfortable. Sometimes, when the living children are very sad or very lonely, they choose to become like us. Then they never have to go home to places where people don't understand them. How many? Not many, she said, quickly. Only the ones who really wanted to stay. Only the ones who asked us to help them. I thought about our Girl Scout troop, how excited they'd been about their new friends, how they'd begged to come back, how they'd seemed to know things they couldn't possibly know. Mary Elizabeth, the girls from last week, are they still connected to you somehow? She nodded. A little bit. When you play our games, you always keep a small piece of our world with you. Most of the time, it fades away. But sometimes what? Sometimes the living children like our world better than theirs. Sometimes they keep asking to come back, over and over, until the connection gets stronger instead of weaker. I realized what was happening. These spirit children weren't evil or malicious. They were just lonely. They'd been playing the same games, waiting for the same families, for decades or centuries. When living children stumbled into their world, it was the happiest they ever felt. But their games existed outside normal time. Their world followed different rules. And children who spent too much time there might forget how to exist anywhere else. I need to bring those girls back here, I said. To play with us again? Mary Elizabeth asked hopefully. To say goodbye properly. And to help you understand something important. What? I looked at all of them. These beautiful, lost children who'd been waiting so long for someone to come find them. Your families never stopped loving you. They never stopped looking for you. But they couldn't find you because you're between worlds now. You're not alive, but you're not really gone either. We know that, said the girl in yellow. That's why we stay here, so they can find us when they come looking. But they won't come looking here. When people die, they go to a different place. a place where you could find them if you chose to go there too. For the first time since I'd 200 and Psychode arrived, the children were completely quiet. You mean, Mary Elizabeth's voice was very small. You mean if we stopped waiting here, we could see our families again? I think so. But it would mean leaving this place. It would mean letting go of the games and the waiting. But what about the living children? Tommy asked. What about our new friends? Who will play with them when they come back? That's when I understood what I had to do. We're going to teach the living children how to say goodbye, and we're going to help you learn how to let go. The next evening, I brought the Girl Scout troop back to the clearing. I'd spent hours explaining the situation to their parents and Mrs. Henderson. It had been the hardest conversation of my life, but they deserved to know the truth about what their daughters had experienced. Some of the parents thought I was crazy, but Mrs. Henderson convinced them to trust me, and the girls themselves had been so desperate to don't return that their families finally agreed. We arrived just as the fog began to roll in. Remember, I told the girls, you're here to say goodbye to your friends. You can play with them one more time, but then you have to help them understand that it's time for them to go home to their real families. When the spirit children appeared, the reunion was joyful but bittersweet. The living girls ran to embrace friends they could barely see, while the spirit children glowed brighter with happiness than I'd ever seen. But this time, things were different. This time, everyone understood that the games had to end. What happened next wasn't like any goodbye I'd ever witnessed. The living girls taught the spirit children about the world they'd left behind. They talked about families and love that continues even after death. They shared stories about grandparents who had died but were still remembered, still loved, still missed. In return, the spirit children shared their own memories, not of being lost, but of being found. They remembered their families' faces, their mothers' voices, the feeling of being safe and loved. For the first time in decades or centuries, they focused on the life they'd had instead of the life they'd lost. As the night went on, some of the spirit children began to fade. I can see my mama, whispered the little boy in overalls. She's calling my name. One by one, 15 of the 23 spirit children chose to leave. They walked into the fog and disappeared, not into nothing, but toward something else. Something that pulled them forward instead of holding them back. But 8 of them chose to stay. We want to help, Mary Elizabeth explained. Living children still get lost in these mountains sometimes. They still need friends to keep them safe until the grown-ups can find them. You understand this means you'll still be between worlds? I asked. Yes, but now we know that our real families are waiting for us whenever we're ready to go to them. That makes the waiting different. And you understand that when living children visit you, it has to be temporary? You can't keep them here forever. We understand. We'll teach them our games, but we'll also teach them how to go home. The fog began to lift as dawn approached. Our Girl Scout troop said their final goodbyes to the friends who had chosen to remain. There were tears, but they were good tears. The kind that come with understanding instead of loss. Over the following months, I worked with Ruth Stamper and other Cherokee elders to establish new protocols for youth programs in the area. We created educational components about the children who had been lost in these mountains over the centuries. We taught respect for the spirits that still watched over the forest. Most importantly, we learned to recognize the signs when living children had encountered the spirit children. It still happened occasionally. A group would get lost in the fog and be found hours later with stories of new friends and impossible games. But now we knew how to help both the living and the dead process these encounters in healthy ways. The Girl Scout troop remained connected to their experience, but in a positive way. They became advocates for forest safety and historians of the area's tragic past. Some of them grew up to become rangers themselves, carrying on the work of bridging the gap between the natural and supernatural worlds. Mrs. Henderson started including Cherokee cultural education in her troop's activities, working with Ruth Stamper to teach the girls about the traditional beliefs that had recognized and honored the spirit children for generations. As for me, I gained abilities I'd never expected. I could sense when the spirit children were present, communicate with them when necessary, and help mediate between their world and ours. It became an unofficial part of my job, one that never appeared in any Forest Service manual, but one that kept both living and dead children safer. The clearing where it all began became a memorial site. Not officially, but families of the lost children started leaving flowers there. Cherokee families honored it as a sacred space. And sometimes, on foggy autumn evenings, you could still hear the sound of children playing games that spanned centuries. The most important thing I learned was that death doesn't always mean gone, and gone doesn't always mean forgotten. Love continues in ways we don't always understand, and sometimes the greatest kindness we can offer is helping someone find their way home, even when home is somewhere we can't follow. The spirit children of Mist Hollow still play their eternal games, but now they also serve as guardians for the living children who visit their forest. They've learned the difference between keeping someone safe and keeping someone prisoner. And sometimes, on the clearest days, I swear I can see Mary Elizabeth Cromwell sitting by Rough Creek, watching over hikers with the patience and love of someone who finally understands that the best way to honor the past is to protect the future. The games continue, but now everyone knows the rules, and everyone knows how they end. My name is Jeremiah Blackwater, and I've been pulling people out of these Virginia mountains for 18 years. Third-generation park ranger, born and raised in the Shenandoah Valley. My daddy taught me these caves before I could tie my own boots, and his daddy before him. We know every hole, every passage, every place the earth can swallow you whole. But I'm getting ahead of myself. It was early December 1962 when everything changed. The kind of cold that bites through your jacket and settles in your bones. Freezing rain had been falling for 3 days straight, coating everything in a sheet of ice that made the mountain roads treacherous as hell. The only warm places for 50 miles were deep underground, where the earth keeps a steady 55 degrees year-round. I was finishing my coffee in the ranger station when the call came in. University geology team, 5 graduate students from Virginia Tech, 3 days overdue from a cave mapping expedition. Their professor had dropped them off at Whitmore's Gap with enough supplies for a week. They were supposed to check in by radio every 12 hours. Last contact was Monday morning, and now it was Thursday. Jeremiah, my supervisor Ray said, hanging up the phone, "You know those caves up past Devil's Backbone better than anyone. How long to get a rescue team up there?" I looked out the window at the ice storm. In this weather, 4 hours minimum, if the roads don't kill us first. These kids have been down there 3 nights, if they're hurt. He didn't need to finish. I knew what 3 nights in a cave system could do to people. Hypothermia, dehydration, panic. I'd seen grown men reduced to whimpering children after just 1 night lost underground. "I'll take Bill and Martinez," I said, already reaching for my gear. "Have dispatch call their families, tell them we're going in." The drive up to Whitmore's Gap took 5 hours instead of 4. Twice we had to stop to chain up, and once Bill had to get out and guide me around a tree that had fallen across the fire road. The university's camp was still there. 3 tents, a camp stove, and a truck with Virginia Tech decals covered in ice. Everything looked normal except for one thing. Fresh coffee was still brewing on the camp stove. I poured myself a cup, still hot, steam rising into the freezing air. "How long does coffee stay hot out here?" Martinez asked, testing the pot with his bare hand. 20 minutes, maybe 30, I said. But even as I said it, I knew something was wrong. The coffee was damn near boiling, like someone had just made it. But there were no footprints in the fresh snow around the camp. No signs anyone had been here since the storm started. "Maybe they came back up to get something," Bill suggested, but his voice didn't sound convinced. I walked over to the cave entrance. It wasn't one of the big tourist caves with concrete paths and electric lights. This was a wild cave, the kind only serious cavers attempt. The opening was maybe 4 feet wide, dropping down at a steep angle before disappearing into darkness. A rope was anchored to a tree nearby, disappearing down into the black. "Radio check," I called into my handheld. Nothing but static. We were in a dead zone up here. Wouldn't have contact with the outside world until we got back down the mountain. I clipped on my helmet, checked my headlamp, and started pulling on my cave gear. 18 years of rescues, and I'd never lost anyone. Wasn't planning to start now. "You boys ready?" I asked Bill and Martinez. They nodded, but I could see the nervousness in their eyes. Neither of them had been caving as long as I had. I tied onto the rope and started down. The first 100 feet were standard Virginia limestone, smooth walls worn by centuries of water, formations that sparkled in the light of our headlamps. The geology students had left markers every 50 feet, orange flagging, tape tied to rock projections, marking their route deeper into the system. But something felt wrong from the start. The cave was too warm. Not the usual cool 55 degrees, but genuinely warm, like there was a heating system running somewhere deep below. And the air was moving in the wrong direction. Cave air should flow out in winter, in through the entrance as the warm underground air meets the cold surface. This air was flowing down, pulling us deeper into the mountain. "You feel that?" Bill asked from behind me. "Feel what?" "The cave's breathing." I stopped and listened. He was right. There was a rhythm to the air movement, like the mountain itself was taking slow, deep breaths. In and out, in and out. "Just thermal currents," I said, but my voice echoed strangely in the passage. Instead of the usual clean echo you get in limestone caves, the sound seemed to stretch and distort, like something was bending it. We found the first piece of equipment 200 feet down. A helmet sitting perfectly upright on a rock shelf. No damage, no signs of struggle. The headlamp was still on, casting a steady beam across the cave wall. "Sarah's helmet," Martinez said, reading the name written on the back in black marker. "She wouldn't have gone anywhere without this." I picked it up and immediately dropped it. The helmet was hot to the touch, like it had been sitting in direct sunlight. But we were 300 feet underground, where no sunlight had ever reached. That's when I heard the voices, faint at first, coming from somewhere deeper in the cave system. Multiple people talking, but I couldn't make out the words. The sound bounced off the cave walls, creating a chorus of whispers that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Hello," I shouted down the passage. "Virginia State Parks, can you hear me?" The voices stopped immediately. Complete silence except for the sound of our own breathing and the steady drip of water somewhere in the darkness. Then, from impossibly far away, a single voice called back, "Help us." We found the rope again, 50 feet deeper, but it wasn't where it should have been. The geology students had been following a standard cave survey technique, rope and straight line whenever possible, rope anchored at every major turn. But this rope led off into a side passage that didn't exist on any survey map I'd ever seen. "This passage isn't supposed to be here," I told Bill, checking my waterproof survey notes. "According to the geological survey, this cave system ends about 100 feet from here in a sump pool. But here we were, looking at a passage that stretched away into darkness, wide enough for 3 people to walk side by side. The walls were smooth, almost polished, and they felt warm under my gloved hands. Maybe it opened up recently," Martinez suggested. "You know, earthquake or something. I've seen new passages created by seismic activity. They're rough, jagged, full of loose rock and debris. This passage looked like it had been worn smooth by water over thousands of years, or carved by something else entirely." We followed the rope deeper. The flagging tape markers were still there, but they were arranged differently now. Instead of being tied randomly to rock projections, they were spaced exactly 10 feet apart in perfect intervals. Someone had moved them, arranged them. "Did you count how many people were in that geology team?" Bill asked. 5, I said. 3 men, 2 women, graduate students. "Then who tied this knot?" He was pointing at a section where the rope was anchored to the cave wall. The knot was perfect, a bowline with a backup hitch that would have taken an expert climber to tie properly. But it was tied with a technique I'd never seen before, using twice as many wraps as necessary. "Maybe one of them has military training," I said, but I was starting to feel uneasy. "Professional. Cavers are particular about their knots. You learn one way and stick with it." This was something different. The passage opened into a larger chamber, and that's where we found the camp. 5 sleeping bags arranged in a perfect circle. Camp stove in the center, still burning blue flame under a pot of what looked like soup. Personal gear organized with military precision along the walls. Everything clean, everything in its place, and no sign of the students anywhere. "Hello," I called out. "Virginia State Parks, we're here to help." My voice echoed back from the darkness beyond our lights, but there was something wrong with the echo. It came back changed, distorted, like the cave walls were made of something other than limestone. I knelt down and touched one of the sleeping bags. Still warm, recently used. But there was something else, a smell I couldn't identify. Not the usual cave smell of damp earth and bat guano. This was organic, alive, like the scent of skin and breath and something else underneath it all. "Jeremiah," Martinez whispered, "look at this." He was crouched next to the wall, shining his light on something carved into the rock. At first I thought it was graffiti. Cavers sometimes carve their initials in caves, though it's against regulations. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't random scratching, it was a picture. Someone had carved a detailed scene into the limestone, using tools that left marks unlike anything I'd ever seen. The lines were too precise, too deep. It would have taken weeks to create this level of detail, even with the best stone-cutting equipment. The picture showed the surface world. Our world. Trees, buildings, roads, even what looked like the ranger station where I worked. But the perspective was wrong. It was drawn from below, like someone deep underground looking up through layers of earth and rock. "How could they know what the ranger station looks like?" Bill asked. "They're college, kids from Blacksburg. They've never been to our station." I didn't have an answer for that. We pressed deeper into the cave, following the rope and the perfectly spaced flagging tape. The temperature kept increasing. By the time we'd been underground for 2 hours, I was sweating inside my heavy cave gear. The air was thick, humid, carrying that same organic smell that had been in the camp. That's when we found the paintings. Not carved like the first one, but painted with some kind of pigment that glowed faintly in our headlamp beams. Dozens of them covering the cave walls like an underground art gallery. And they were all of us. I'm not kidding. Perfect portraits of Bill, Martinez, and me. Detailed enough that you could count the whiskers on Bill's face and see the scar on Martinez's chin from a climbing accident 3 years ago. But we'd never been in this cave before. Hell, this cave wasn't supposed to exist. "That's my jacket," Martinez said, pointing at his portrait. "Look, you can see the patch I sewed on last month." The paintings were arranged like a timeline, showing us driving up the mountain, setting up at the camp, entering the cave. They showed us finding the helmet, following the rope, discovering the sleeping bags. They showed us looking at the paintings. The last painting was empty, just a frame painted on the cave wall, waiting for something to fill it. "We need to get out of here," Bill said. His voice was shaking. "This isn't a rescue anymore. This is something else." But before we could turn around, we heard the sound. It started as a low humming, so deep I felt it in my chest rather than heard it with my ears. The kind of sound you feel in your bones when a big truck passes by, but stronger, much stronger. The humming rose in pitch until it became a whistle, then a shriek that made my teeth ache. It was coming from deeper in the cave, echoing off the walls and creating harmonics that seemed to vibrate inside my skull. And then, cutting through the inhuman noise, we heard human voices screaming. "That's them," I said, grabbing my gear. "That's the students." But as we ran toward the screaming, following the rope deeper into the mountain, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. That something in the darkness beyond our lights was following us, matching our pace, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. The cave passage split into 3 directions ahead of us. The screaming was coming from the middle tunnel. But as we approached the junction, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Fresh footprints in the cave mud. Human footprints, but wrong. The toes were too long, the stride too wide, and there were too many of them. Far more than 5 college students could have made. Someone else was down here with us. Someone who had been watching us since we entered the cave. Someone who knew what we looked like well enough to paint our portraits on the cave walls. The screaming stopped suddenly, leaving us in absolute silence. Then, from all 3 passages at once, we heard voices calling our names. Jeremiah, Bill, Martinez. But they weren't the voices of college students in distress. They were something else entirely. Something that had learned our names and was using them to call us deeper into the dark. We chose the middle passage because that's where the screaming had come from, but as soon as we entered it, I knew we'd made a mistake. The passage curved sharply to the left, then to the right, then split again. Within 50 feet, we'd lost sight of the junction behind us. "The rope," Martinez said. Where's the rope? He was right. The rope that had led us this far simply ended at a blank cave wall. No anchor point, no frayed end where it might have broken. We stopped. Back up, I said. We follow our own footprints back to the junction. But when we turned around, our footprints were gone. The cave floor was smooth, undisturbed limestone with no sign that anyone had ever walked on it. That's impossible, Bill said. We just came this way. Our boots were leaving clear prints in the mud. I knelt down and touched the cave floor. It was dry as bone, polished smooth like marble, but I knew we'd been walking through muddy sections just moments before. I'd felt our boots sinking into the soft earth with every step. Jeremiah. Martinez's voice was tight with fear. My headlamp. I looked at him. His headlamp was dimming, the beam growing weaker, even though he'd put fresh batteries in before we entered the cave. Mine was doing the same thing. Bill's had already gone out completely. Equipment failure, I said, but I was lying to myself as much as to them. This wasn't normal battery drain. Something was actively draining the power from our lights. We pressed forward in the growing darkness, using our backup flashlights and emergency glow sticks. The passage opened into another chamber, this one larger than the first. Our weakening lights couldn't reach the walls or ceiling, making it feel like we were floating in a black void. That's when we found Sarah. She was sitting against the far wall, perfectly motionless, her eyes closed, still wearing her caving gear, still breathing. But something was terribly wrong. Sarah, I called out. Sarah, can you hear me? She opened her eyes, and I immediately wished she hadn't. Her eyes were completely white. No iris, no pupil, just solid white that seemed to glow faintly in our fading light. When she spoke, her voice echoed strangely, like it was coming from somewhere far away. You shouldn't have come here, she said. They don't like visitors from above. Who doesn't like visitors? I asked, kneeling down beside her. Sarah, we're here to rescue you. Where are the others? She tilted her head to the side, listening to something I couldn't hear. Then she smiled, and I saw that her teeth had changed. They were longer, sharper, filed to points. They're coming, she whispered. They want to meet you. That's when the walls started moving. I'm not talking about cave-ins or rock falls. The walls themselves were moving, pulsing like living tissue. The limestone surface rippled and flowed, creating new passages where none had existed moments before. Openings appeared and disappeared like breathing pores in the skin of some massive creature. Run, Sarah said, but she didn't move. She just sat there with her white eyes and sharp teeth, watching us with the patience of someone who knew we had nowhere to go. We ran anyway. The cave system had become a maze that changed around us as we moved through it. Passages led to dead ends that hadn't been there before. Chambers opened into new rooms that defied the geology of the mountain. We were no longer in a natural cave system. We were inside something alive. Bill was the first to go. We were moving through a narrow passage, single file, when the walls simply closed in on him. Not gradually, but instantly, like giant jaws snapping shut. One moment he was behind me, the next moment the passage was solid rock with no sign it had ever been wide enough for a person to pass through. His scream cut off abruptly. Then silence. Bill, I shouted, pounding on the wall where he'd disappeared. Bill, can you hear me? Martinez grabbed my arm. He's gone, Jeremiah. The wall is solid. It's like he was never there. But I could hear something from inside the rock. A tapping sound, like fingers drumming against stone. Tap, 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 getting fainter and fainter until it stopped completely. We kept moving because we had no choice. The passage behind us had sealed itself. There was only forward now, deeper into the living cave system that was herding us toward something I didn't want to meet. That's when we started hearing the voices. Not of human voices this time. These were different, deeper, resonating through the cave walls themselves. They spoke in a language I'd never heard, but somehow I understood the meaning. They were talking about us, discussing us like we were specimens in a laboratory. The surface dwellers, they said, contaminated by the poison air above, but perhaps salvageable, perhaps useful, another voice replied. The old one requires fresh blood for the deep work. Martinez stopped walking. You hear that too? I nodded. We need to find another way out. These caves connect to the surface somewhere. There has to be another entrance. But even as I said it, I knew we weren't going to find one. Whatever this place was, it wasn't connected to any surface entrance marked on any map. We'd passed beyond the natural cave system into something else entirely. The passage opened into the largest chamber yet. Our failing flashlights couldn't reach the walls or ceiling, but I could sense vast space around us. The air moved differently in large spaces, and this felt enormous, cathedral-sized. And we weren't alone. They stood in a circle around us, maybe 30 feet away, just at the edge of our fading light. Tall figures, pale as limestone, with eyes that reflected our flashlight beams like mirrors. They didn't move, didn't speak. They just watched us with the patience of creatures that had all the time in the world. "Jeremiah?" Martinez whispered. "What are they?" Before I could answer, one of them stepped forward into our light. It had been human once. The basic shape was still there, 2 arms, 2 legs, a head. But everything was wrong. The limbs were too long, the fingers extended into claws that could dig through solid rock. The skin was white as paper and seemed to glow with its own faint light. And the eyes were solid black, like staring into deep water at night. When it spoke, the voice came from everywhere at once, resonating, through the cave walls and the floor beneath our feet. "Welcome to the deep places, surface dwellers. You have been expected." The circle of figures began to close in around us. I counted at least 20 of them, moving with fluid grace that seemed to ignore gravity. Some walked on the cave floor, others moved along the walls and ceiling, as easily as if they were on level ground. "The deep voice wishes to speak with you," the creature continued. "You will come willingly, or you will come unwillingly. The choice is yours, but you will come." I looked at Martinez. We were cave rescue specialists, trained for emergencies and technical rescues. But nothing in our training had prepared us for this. We were dealing with something that shouldn't exist, in a place that couldn't exist, facing creatures that had stepped out of nightmares. But I was still a ranger. These were still my mountains. And somewhere in this underground maze, there were still people who needed rescuing. "We'll come," I said. "But first, we want to see the others, all of them." The creature that had spoken tilted its head, considering. Then it smiled, revealing teeth that were sharp as broken glass. "Oh, you will see them," it said. "The deep voice has plans for all the surface dwellers, plans that require participation." As they led us deeper into the mountain, I caught glimpses of what this place really was, not just caves, but a city. Carved chambers connected by smooth passages, living spaces carved into the rock walls, evidence of a civilization that had existed here for centuries. And everywhere, painted on every wall, were images of the surface world. Detailed pictures of towns, forests, highways, buildings, all drawn with the accuracy of someone who had been watching us for a very long time. The creatures weren't just living down here. They were studying us, learning about us, preparing for something. We were being taken to meet their leader, this deep voice they kept talking about. But as we descended deeper into their underground city, passing chambers filled with pale figures who watched us with black eyes, I realized something that chilled me to the bone. We weren't the first surface dwellers they'd brought down here. The walls of the passages were decorated with what I'd first taken for artistic carvings. But looking closer, I could see they were actually bones, human bones, arranged in complex patterns and embedded into the living rock. Some of those bones looked very old, but others looked recent, very recent. The deep voice was waiting for us in what I can only describe as a throne room carved from living rock. The chamber was enormous, with a ceiling that disappeared into darkness above our heads. The walls curved around us in perfect acoustics, creating a natural amphitheater that would carry even a whisper to every corner of the space. And in the center, on a raised platform of polished limestone, sat something that had once been human. He was ancient beyond measure. His skin was translucent, white, stretched over bones that seemed too long for any human frame. His eyes had gone completely white with age, but somehow I knew he could see us perfectly. When he breathed, the sound echoed through the chamber like wind through a canyon, but it was his voice that truly made him alien. When he spoke, the sound came from the cave walls themselves, as if the entire mountain was speaking through him. "Jeremiah Blackwater," he said. and my name resonated through the chamber like thunder. Third-generation ranger of the surface lands. You have brought us visitors. The creatures that had captured us pushed Martinez and me forward until we stood at the base of the platform. Up close, I could see that the deep voice wasn't sitting on a throne, he was connected to it. Veins or roots of some kind grew from his body into the rock itself, as if he'd become part of the cave system. Where are the students? I demanded. Where are my people? The deep voice smiled, revealing teeth that had been filed to sharp points centuries ago. Your people, he repeated. How interesting. You still think of them as yours. With a gesture from his elongated hand, the cave wall behind him became transparent. Through it, I could see into another chamber, where the 4 missing geology students sat in a circle. They were alive, but changed. Their skin had taken on the same pale luminescence as the creatures around us. Their eyes were beginning to turn white. They are learning, the deep voice said. Learning to live as humans were meant to live. In the deep places, away from the poison light of the surface world. Let them go, I said. Take me instead. I'm the one you really want. The deep voice laughed, and the sound made stalactites rain down from the ceiling high above. You misunderstand, surface dweller. We do not want prisoners. We want converts. We want teachers. Your people above have forgotten the old ways, but we remember. We remember when your kind fled underground to escape the death that fell from the sky. He gestured again, and the walls around us came alive with moving pictures. Not painted images this time, but living scenes that played out in the rock itself like some kind of natural movie screen. I saw scenes of the past, Cherokee villages burning, people fleeing into the mountains, seeking shelter in the deep caves. But these weren't scenes from history books. These were memories, preserved in the living rock of the cave system. Your ancestor brought them here, the deep voice continued. Jeremiah Blackwater I. He led them into the deep places when the death light fell from the sky and poisoned the surface world. The scenes shifted, showing people adapting to life underground. Generations passing, children born who never saw sunlight. Bodies changing, elongating, eyes adapting to perfect darkness. Becoming something new, something better suited to the deep places. We are what your people became, the deep voice said. We are what you are meant to become. The surface world is ending, Jeremiah Blackwater. The poison light grows stronger each year. Soon there will be nowhere safe but the deep places. I looked around the chamber at the pale creatures watching us with their black eyes. I saw the truth in their inhuman faces. They weren't monsters. They were people. People who had adapted to survive in a world they believed was ending. But they were wrong about one thing. The surface world isn't ending, I said. And I'm not my ancestor. I'm taking my people home. The deep voice leaned forward, and I could see the ancient hatred in his white eyes. You cannot leave, he said. The deep places do not release what they claim. You will stay. You will learn. You will become what you were meant to be. That's when Martinez surprised everyone, including me. He'd been quiet since our capture, letting me do the talking. But while I'd been focused on the deep voice, he'd been studying the chamber. Martinez was our technical expert, the one who understood geology and cave formations better than anyone. The acoustics, he whispered to me. Everything in this chamber is designed around sound. That's how he controls the cave system. Before I could stop him, Martinez pulled out his emergency whistle, the kind we used for cave rescue signals, and blew it as hard as he could. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space. But more than that, it was the wrong frequency for the chamber's acoustics. The whistle's piercing shriek created a feedback loop that made the cave walls themselves vibrate. The deep voice screamed and clutched his head. The creatures around us stumbled and fell as the harmonics disrupted whatever connection they had to the cave system. For a moment, the walls stopped moving. The passages stopped changing, and we were in a normal cave again. Run, Martinez shouted. We ran. But the deep voice recovered quickly. His ancient voice boomed through the chamber, calling his followers to pursue us. The cave system came alive again, passages shifting and changing to trap us, but Martinez kept blowing his whistle in short bursts, disrupting their control just long enough for us to stay ahead of our pursuers. We reached the chamber where the students were being held. The transparent wall had become solid rock again, but Martinez found a crack in the stone, and managed to widen it with his demolition charges, small explosive devices we carried for emergency rescues. The explosion brought down part of the ceiling, but it also freed the students. They were changed, but not beyond saving. We could still get them out. The way we came in, I shouted over the sound of pursuing creatures. Follow our original route, but Martinez shook his head. That passage is sealed, has been, since we arrived. There's only one way out now. He pointed up. Above us, a vertical shaft led toward the surface. It was narrow, unstable, and would require technical climbing to reach. But it was our only chance. Can you make it? I asked the students. Sarah, her eyes still white but her voice her own again, nodded. We're geology students. We know how to climb. The creatures were getting closer. I could hear their voices echoing through the passages, coordinating their search. They would find us soon. Go, I told Martinez. Get them out. I'll buy you time. Jeremiah? No, we all go together. But I was already pulling out my remaining demolition charges. Someone has to seal this place. Make sure they can't follow you to the surface. The last thing I saw before the charges went off was Martinez leading the students up the vertical shaft toward daylight and freedom. The explosion brought down tons of rock, sealing the chamber and hopefully trapping the deep voice and his followers in their underground city. I should have died in that cave-in. By all rights, the falling rock should have crushed me, but somehow I found myself in a small air pocket, buried but alive. And in the darkness, I heard something that chilled me more than anything else that had happened. The deep voice, speaking from somewhere beyond the collapsed rock. You cannot seal the deep places forever, Jeremiah Blackwater. We have other entrances, other ways to the surface. This is not over. It took me 16 hours to dig my way out of that collapse. When I finally reached the surface, I found Martinez and the students safe at the ranger station. But they'd all changed in ways that couldn't be easily explained. Their eyes were sensitive to bright light. They couldn't tolerate the cold. And sometimes, late at night, they would talk about the deep places, like they missed them. The official report said it was a cave-in during a rescue attempt. 5. Students trapped underground for 4 days. 3 rangers deployed for emergency extraction. 1 fatality, Bill Martinez, listed as missing and presumed dead in the collapse. The geology department quietly closed the cave survey project and marked the area as geologically unstable. But I know the truth. Martinez transferred to a different Park Service region within a month. Said he couldn't handle cave work anymore. The students finished their degrees but all changed their majors. None of them would talk about what happened underground, at least not officially. I can't do cave rescues anymore. Can't even walk into a basement without breaking into a cold sweat. The sound of dripping water makes my hands shake. But worse than the claustrophobia is the knowing. The deep voice was right about one thing. They do have other entrances. Over the past 6 months, I've documented 17 reports of similar incidents across the Appalachian cave systems. People going missing underground. Rescue teams finding evidence of impossible excavations in virgin caves. Ancient artwork that shows perfect knowledge of the surface world. And the seismic activity has been increasing. My new assignment is a fire tower on Hawks Peak, 20 miles from the sealed cave system. Officially, I'm watching for forest fires and monitoring weather patterns. Unofficially, I'm keeping an eye on the mountain where we encountered the deep voice. Every night, I feel vibrations through the tower's metal framework. Rhythmic tremors that pulse like a heartbeat. The local Cherokee Tribal Council has noticed it too. Their elders have started talking about the old stories again. Stories about the Nunahai, the immortal people who live in the mountains and sometimes take surface dwellers back with them to the deep places. 3 weeks ago, a new cave entrance appeared on the south face of Devil's Backbone. Just opened up overnight, like the mountain itself split open. The geological survey team says it's impossible. Rock formations don't just appear without seismic activity. But there it is. A perfectly round opening leading down into darkness. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind is still, I can hear voices coming from inside that new cave. Human voices, calling for help, but I know better than to go down there alone. The government has taken an interest now. There's a research station disguised as a weather monitoring facility set up about 5 miles from here. Black SUVs with government plates come and go at all hours. They've brought in specialists, geologists, anthropologists, linguists, people who study things that aren't supposed to exist. Martinez visits sometimes. He won't talk about the caves directly, but he tells me about the dreams. Dreams of the deep places, of pale figures moving through endless tunnels of living rock. Dreams of the deep voice calling them back home. "Do you think they're still down there?" he asked to me last week. I nodded toward the mountain where new caves keep appearing every few months. They're not just still down there, they're expanding. The Cherokee elders have a theory. They say the Nunehi aren't evil spirits trying to drag people underground. They're the last survivors of a great catastrophe, people who fled to the deep places when the world above became uninhabitable. They've been waiting underground for centuries, watching the surface world, preparing for the day when they would have to emerge again. And they think that day is coming soon. I don't know if they're right. I don't know if the deep voice and his people are trying to save humanity or replace it. But I know one thing for certain. What we found in those caves wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning. Every night I sit in my fire tower, watching the mountains and listening to the earth breathe. And every night I see new lights in places where no lights should be. Pale, cold, illumination coming from caves that didn't exist the day before. The deep places are waking up, and sooner or later, they're going to come looking for the rest of us. My name is Jeremiah Blackwater, and I used to think I knew these mountains. Now I know the mountains know me too. They're watching, waiting, preparing, and somewhere far below, in chambers carved from living rock, the deep voice is calling my name.